Timeless Assassin by author Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 1121-1150. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel. Get early access to video on Patreon. Planet Satoru, Central Military Base, Leo's POV. In the days that followed Yurulo's audience with Yukiro, orders began moving rapidly across U-clan territory, as branch leaders, frontier governors, and distant outpost commanders all received urgent summons to contribute forces toward a counter-offensive aimed at reclaiming Planet Satoru. What had first begun as a contained military response soon started resembling mass mobilization, as fleets were reassigned, reserve battalions recalled, supply routes redirected, and staging points established across multiple U-clan worlds in preparation for a campaign far larger than an ordinary punitive expedition. Naturally, movements of that scale could not remain hidden for long, especially not from a cult information network perfected by Chaosbringer, and so it was only a matter of time before a compiled report reached Leo's desk. "My lord, it is unfolding almost exactly as you anticipated," Shadow Number 1 said, as he stood before Leo with the report open in hand while several tactical projections hovered beside him. "It appears that the U-clan patriarch, Yurulo, intends to lead the counter-offensive personally, and current estimates suggest he is assembling a grand fleet large enough not merely to contest Satoru, but to force us into revealing the extent of our strength whether we wish to or not," he continued, his tone measured as he relayed the intelligence. Leo listened without interruption, and as the report continued, a faint smile gradually started to form across his face. "Yes, that sounds about right," he said at last, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction as though hearing confirmation of a move he had already seen several steps in advance. "I reckon they will need another 3 or 4 weeks before their force is properly assembled, and once it is, they will come down on us with everything they believe necessary to overwhelm us in one decisive blow," he continued, as his smile sharpened. "They will believe they have the upper hand. And then, when we crush them." Leo paused, as he let that thought linger while stifling a chuckle. There was no bravado in the statement, only conviction, as by now he had already run through this scenario enough times in his mind to feel almost bored by its predictability. Because from his perspective, the approaching fleet was not a threat interrupting his plans. It was his plan. Its arrival was the next piece falling where it was supposed to in his grand scheme to restore the cult to its once former glory. Shadow Number 1 seemed to understand that much, though he still asked carefully, "My lord, are you certain that killing Yurulo will be enough to force Yukiro to act personally?" As Leo nodded in confidence. "From my perspective, he has no other choice," Leo began, as he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The fleet itself is secondary, because ships can be rebuilt and armies can be replenished, but a patriarch dying at the hands of the cult is something that must be answered to keep the pride of the organization intact. So yes, I'm sure Yukiro will come," Leo assured, as Shadow Number 1 nodded in understanding. Meanwhile, Myron's POV. Myron had been on Planet Satoru for 3 weeks now, and as scheduled, exactly on the 21st day, he finally received the marching orders he had been restlessly waiting for, as Commander James's fleet was set to depart for Planet Yamana the following day to conduct reinforcement operations there for 3 days before moving onward toward a new military campaign. The moment the order reached his hands, something inside him stirred instantly, because after weeks of drills, inspections, fortification duties, and routines that often felt painfully ordinary, the word deployment suddenly made all those slow days feel like prelude rather than delay. "Fuck yeah, finally I get some action," he yelled, as he felt excited to get out of this monotonous routine that had settled over his life. And yet, as excited as he was to go forward, those 21 days had changed him more than he expected, because in that short span he had learned more about the outer universe than years of studying ever taught him back inside the cult. Because reading about the galaxy net in textbooks, and actually accessing it as a lieutenant were two different things, as once he finally saw the kind of hatred the righteous netizens had towards the cult, he felt enlightened in a whole different way. 90% of the information up there about the cult was wrong, and it was not even the soldiers and righteous military that hated the cult the most, but rather some commoners, who seemed to hate the cult too. Their bones. "If I ever get my hands on a cultist, I will ******************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************* The reason behind why they're so much stronger at the same tier is because they consume taboo substances. I heard Leo Skyshard once ordered the death of 1,000 enemies by bleeding them out through the asshole. He's a perverse and sick bastard that made his soldiers stick weapons up righteous soldiers' rectum and made our brave men bleed too. Death slowly then. Someone had written, as the more that Myron read, the more surprised he became at how different the universe really was versus what he had imagined. Yeah, Dad is too kind to let the righteous citizens live with the kind of hatred they have towards us. If it were me in charge of the cult, I'd show these bastards no mercy. Myron muttered, as he shook his head from side to side in disappointment. Once all this is over, once we win the war against them, I'll have a conversation with the old man on how to achieve lasting peace. He's too soft. He thinks our enemies are only men who point their weapons towards us, while what he should think is that everyone who isn't one of us are our enemies. Myron muttered, as he closed the galaxy net and let out a deep sigh. He was young, and he still had a lot more to see and mature, and yet, he already had an image forming in his head about the righteous faction. An image where every last one of them felt like an enemy in his mind. 3 weeks later, U-Clan Expeditionary Fleet, Urulo's POV. 3 weeks later, the U-Clan fleets finally departed planet U-Prime under Urulo's command, as countless warships rose from orbital staging zones in layered formations and began moving toward Satoru in what was easily the largest military mobilization the clan had mounted in generations. Though to outside observers the departure projected confidence and order, Urulo knew too well how fragile that confidence had actually been during the weeks leading to this moment, because securing the participation of branch leaders and frontier commanders had proven far harder than issuing summons alone. For the first time in his memory, visible hesitation had greeted a Patriarch's war call, as several commanders delayed compliance under various excuses while others requested time, logistics, or revised commitments, all revealing a reluctance that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. And Urulo understood exactly what lay beneath that hesitation, because fear of the cult had spread far deeper through U territory than many openly admitted, especially after stories surrounding the vanished 10,000-ship fleet began circulating beyond channels the clan could realistically suppress. An extinction at that scale had been impossible to bury, and with rumor magnifying every retelling, many officers had begun treating General Sparrow less as a battlefield unknown and more as a looming catastrophe they wished to avoid meeting at all. It was only after Urulo convened a private war council with all concerned commanders and revealed the existence of Yukiro's aura orbs that resistance began to soften, because the moment those divine weapons were shown, hesitation amongst those who knew about its power disappeared. Once they understood that Yukiro himself had armed this expedition and had entrusted its patriarch with tools carrying the force of a god, many took it as reassurance that this was not a reckless death march, but a campaign the clan god expected to succeed. And beyond that, Urulo's personal decision to lead the offensive himself carried weight among them, because even the most cautious among those commanders reasoned that Yukiro would not send the sitting patriarch into an unwinnable disaster while doing nothing to ensure his survival. So in the end they joined. Some with confidence, some with resignation, most with guarded hope. As the journey from U-Prime to Satoru finally began, the expected duration to reach enemy territory was 3 days, yet only hours after departure, word of the mobilization had already begun spreading beyond U-Command circles, because a movement involving this many ships, commanders, and supply convoys could never remain concealed for long no matter how tightly the clan tried to control the information. Cult intelligence naturally learned of it almost at once. Merchant networks whispered of it. Neutral observers tracked it, and other great clans began watching carefully. Because what had begun as a contested occupation of one captured world was now being perceived across the universe as something much larger, as more and more factions started recognizing that the battle for Satoru might become the first major test of strength between the resurging cult and the old powers that had long ruled uncontested. Across trade worlds, frontier stations, and military circles, speculation spread almost as quickly as the fleets themselves moved, as some predicted the U-Clan would crush the cult outright while others quietly wondered whether the opposite might happen and change the balance of power entirely. And because of that uncertainty, what lay ahead was no longer merely a campaign. It was becoming an event the universe had begun watching. Meanwhile on planet Satoru, Leo and Ver's POV. As soon as the news about enemy mobilization arrived, Leo and Ver convened to hold the final strategy talk, where they discussed the approach on how they wanted to fight this war. I suggest you let me go and greet them alone. Let's end this fight in the same way we ended the last one, where I wiped them off without a trace. Ver said, as Leo rubbed his chin in contemplation at that offer. The intelligence report already says that the rumor mill is already spinning stories about General Sparrow and his abilities. I say, let me double down on it and upgrade my legend. If I take another fleet out, Yukiro would be forced to act. And then, he would come for me, not you. So when you show up as well, he would be surprised. Ver suggested, as Leo nodded, half in agreement, while the other Half still seemed unconvinced. What happened, cuz? What's bothering you? Are you not satisfied with my plan? Ver asked, as Leo finally looked at him and let out a long sigh. It's not that I'm not unconvinced. It's more that I feel like you're doing too much. A war is a shared responsibility, Ver. Yes, we are the leaders of the cult. But if we keep fighting the battles of our people for them, just because we can, then are we truly protecting them? Or are we making them weaker by learning to only rely on us, rather than fend for themselves? Leo asked, as fell silent at that question. We have 4 commanders present on this planet right now. And over 4 billion troops. I know we have plans for all of them in the coming future. But isn't crisis like these exactly what they have trained for? Yes, a few million may die. But that's not a reason to not deploy them. What happens when the U clan attacks and we aren't around? On those days, they will need the battle experience. So I'm just wondering, if I should deploy a unit alongside you or not. Because, on one hand, they will be safer with you around. And on the other, it will better prepare them for future scenarios. Leo explained, as Ver fell into silent contemplation at those words. Yes, him fighting alone could ensure that no one died. However, what Leo said was also justified. He and Leo could not fight all the battles for their men, and they had to learn to fend for themselves sooner or later. So, it was better that they learn beside them, rather than alone, so that the losses could be minimized, while the experience was gained. If that's your decision, then I don't mind taking a unit or 2 with me to this war. But again, it's not my favorite idea, because these will be deaths that we could have avoided if only we fought ourselves. Ver said, as Leo found himself trapped in a moral dilemma. No matter how he thought about it, there did not seem to be a perfect solution to this problem, as both situations seemed to come with their own sets of pros and cons. Yes, you have to take 1 billion troops with you, Ver. Although I'm not a fan of letting our men die pointless deaths. I'm also not a fan of making the same mistakes Soren did. Leo began, as he pinched the bridge of his nose to show his regret in making this hard decision. The reason behind why the cult fell to its miserable state was partly because of the corrupt elders running it on behalf of Soren, and partly because Soren did not let his men suffer any true hardships. He protected the cult way too much, and because of that, the cult became overdependent on Soren for security. I don't want to make the same mistake as Soren. Although it's hard, I want the cult, its commanders, and its soldiers to be independent thinkers and problem solvers, and for that I'm willing to put them through hell. For I truly believe, they will come out the other side stronger. Leo said, as Ver nodded in acceptance. For once, he did not genuinely believe that his and Leo's thoughts aligned on this issue, however, they did not need to. The cult master had made his decision, and it was his duty as commander general to follow it without question. I will do as you say, cult master, he said, before bowing to take his leave, as Leo let out another long sigh. This was not an easy decision for him to make, and yet he knew deep down it was the right one, because an army protected from every hardship would never grow sharp enough to survive without its strongest guardians. If the cult was to become a force capable of outliving him and Ver one day, then its soldiers needed battle scars, judgment, and the confidence that came only through surviving real war. Yes, some will die, Leo muttered, as even admitting it left a bitter taste in his mouth, but if they do not bleed beside us now, they may perish helplessly without us later. That was the logic he could not ignore. Pain now could prevent collapse later. And while it felt harsh, he believed hardship was sometimes the truest form of preparation. Let this battle temper them, he said quietly, as his resolve settled. Because maybe this was not merely the defense of Satoru. Maybe this was where a true imperial army began. 3 days later, outer perimeter of planet Satoru, Caleb's POV. Since Leo decided that Ver was to take 1 cult unit with him to face the enemy. After contemplating, Ver decided to take Commander Anderson Silva and his unit with him, which also happened to include Caleb. Caleb stood inside the pilot's cabin of a cult destroyer as the fleet advanced in formation behind General Sparrow's flagship, while tension sat quietly beneath the disciplined calm he forced onto his face. Through the forward viewing glass, his eyes remained fixed on the lead warship cutting through space ahead of them, as Sparrow's vessel held the vanguard and shielded the rest of the formation from whatever might emerge first. This was Caleb's first true deployment beyond fortification duty, and although he had long imagined war as something glorious, the reality of marching toward battle aboard a warship made him feel more nervous than he cared to admit. Because out here, he controlled nothing. He did not have the ability to survive the vacuum of space, nor did he have anything to realistically contribute in this battle, as this was a fight for the Air Force only. And yet, as a lieutenant, remaining planetside had never truly been an option for him either, because while most of his assigned unit stayed below in support positions, command responsibility required him to be present in places where decisions might need to be made in real time. I just hope our defensive shields don't malfunction, Caleb prayed internally, sweat beads rolling down his spine, while externally he tried to project a face of confidence. His presence on board was not merely symbolic, as in fleet warfare morale traveled strangely through ranks, and soldiers often drew confidence simply from seeing an officer willing to share the same danger as themselves. As although he himself felt nervous, the fact that he stood there was a huge morale booster for the Air Force. Nobody becomes a great soldier by letting only his men fight, Caleb muttered softly, as an old lesson from Leo surfaced in his mind with surprising clarity. If you want to lead warriors into death someday, then you first have to stand where death can reach you too, he added, as repeating it eased something inside him. Leo had taught him to be brave from a young age. And hence, now that it was time to put those words to practice, Caleb felt as though he could not shy away and disrespect his father's teachings. Sigh. A deep sigh escaped him, as he pressed a hand against the console beside him and tried to calm the pounding of his heart without letting the crew around him notice. Fear was there, he knew that. Yet it was not the kind of fear that made him wish to run, but the kind that sharpened awareness and made every moment feel painfully real. And as the fleet continued toward the coming battle beneath General Sparrow's lead, Caleb found himself silently hoping for the same thing every first-time soldier hoped for. That when war finally arrived, he would be lucky enough to survive it. Meanwhile, Eurulo's POV. Eurulo was not surprised to see an entire cult fleet coming to intercept his advance, as against the 25,000 ships under his command, the enemy had committed roughly 8,000 vessels to contest their approach. And strangely, that sight made him more confident rather than cautious, because seeing ordinary fleet resistance made the exaggerated rumors surrounding General Sparrow suddenly feel far less monstrous than they had in whispered retellings. So all those stories about one man wiping out an entire reinforcement fleet were just that, stories, Eurulo muttered, as he watched enemy formations hold position across the void before them. In his mind, the earlier fleet must have faced a concealed formation or some battlefield deception misread in chaos, because he found it difficult to believe one warship had truly annihilated such a force alone. Maybe stealth formations had been involved. Maybe the earlier commanders panicked. Maybe myth had grown where battlefield confusion once stood. However, whatever the truth was, the fact remained that the enemy now stood plainly before him in numbers he could measure, and numbers were something Eurulo trusted far more than legends. The U-clan held superiority here. They held momentum. And if brute attrition became necessary, then the U-clan had ships enough to grind this opposition down through sheer numbers alone. These mongrels won't last a minute once we crash through them, he said coldly, as the fleet continued advancing in disciplined silence while weapons systems quietly moved toward readiness. For a while, neither side fired. Then the command hall emitted a sharp signal. Beep. An incoming transmission. One of the officers routed it through the bridge as a voice rang. Through the chamber, calm and almost amused despite the threat. Woven beneath it. U-clan fleet, this is your final warning, turn away now or be reduced to ash. A cult voice said, as a few officers stiffened at those words. However, Eurulo did not. He stepped forward himself and took the communicator, his voice carrying the weight of rank as he answered with open confidence. Who is this speaking on the other side, and which fool exactly thinks he can threaten the patriarch of the U-clan? He asked, as a brief pause followed. Then the reply came. This is General Sparrow, the voice said lazily. But you can call me your father, because I vaguely remember spending a few spicy nights with your mother. Ver said, as several officers froze at that response. Eurulo's jaw tightened instantly, though through effort alone he refused to react to the insult the way lesser men might have. This was an obvious regabate, and he knew better than to fall for something so plain. Sparrow, so you are the mysterious general people keep talking about, Eurulo replied, his tone almost courteous now, though fury stirred beneath every word. Well, fortune smiles on you today, because you happen to be speaking to Eurulo himself, and I will offer you a kindness an evil cultist like you rarely receives. He leaned toward the transmitter slightly. Surrender now, enter my custody, and I may allow the rest of your men to live after we seize their ships. Refuse, and I will erase your fleet in an instant. He warned, as laughter answered him. Unbridled laughter, as Ver could not contain his emotions. All right then, Ver replied. Let's see who erases who. he said, as the transmission died, and silence returned. Sigh. Rulo exhaled slowly as he reached into his robes and withdrew one of Yukiro's aura orbs, its compressed radiance pulsing in his palm. While even nearby officers instinctively stepped back from its pressure. For the first time since departure, he allowed himself to feel the comfort of divine insurance. Then he narrowed his eyes towards Sparrow's flagship. How dare you insult my mother? Let's see how you survive this, you piece of shit, he muttered, as he began funneling the orb's destructive aura toward the enemy line, as he prepared to crush it at once. Outer perimeter of planet Satoru, there in Rulo's POV. The moment Rulo crushed the aura orb within his palm, a violent burst of divine power spilled outward from his hand and surged into the void ahead with a pressure so immense that even seasoned veterans around him fell to their knees in weakness. What insane power, a U-clan commander muttered, as he realized that this was not ordinary power being unleashed. This was the wrath of a god compressed into one powerful attack. Wave. And as that expanding wave rolled toward the cult fleet, it carried with it a suffocating pressure that made space itself seem unstable, as though even the stars beyond had dimmed before its passing. FWOOSH. Aboard Sparrow's flagship, the first impact arrived like a catastrophe. The warship lurched violently. Its hull groaned. Warning signals screamed through the cabin. And men who had moments ago stood alert around there dropped unconscious where they stood, unable to endure the pressure radiating through the vessel as the divine wave began swallowing the ship whole. Panels burst apart overhead. Mana circuits ruptured. Entire control arrays sparked and failed. And for one suspended moment, it seemed as though both the flagship and the fleet behind it would be erased together beneath a single divine strike. Yet in that critical instant, Ver acted to counter. As rather than allowing the wave to pass through him and continue consuming the fleet, he pushed his own aura outward and forged a massive defensive field before the formation, as he created a massive aura shield to safeguard the men behind him. Tremble. Wobble. The burden hit him like a collapsing mountain, as divine force hammered against his defenses while his ship began tearing apart around him, as within seconds the flagship erupted in flame because its frame could no longer contain what was coursing through it. Kaboom! The vessel exploded. Burning debris scattered through space. And through that collapsing inferno, Ver still remained suspended amidst fire and wreckage, as he continued absorbing the incoming force with gritted teeth while blood steadily rose in his throat. However, while Ver struggled to contain that wrath, Rulo fared no better on his side, as channeling the aura of a god toward a chosen target was far more punishing than simply unleashing destruction without control. To direct that power solely toward the cult fleet while preventing it from spilling back upon his own formation demanded everything Rulo had, as the strain made his mana circuits scream while he forced the divine force forward through sheer will. Let's go, Clan Master. Destroy them all, Lord Patriarch. Voices erupted around him in wild celebration, because all they saw was Sparrow's flagship burning apart in the distance, while none of them yet understood what Ver was enduring within that storm. Boom. 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 Then more ships behind Ver began bursting apart one after another, as a few rogue strands of the divine force slipped past his containment and tore into the rear formation despite his efforts. Those scattered explosions sent fresh waves of triumph through the U-clan command vessels, because to them it looked as though the cult line was finally collapsing exactly as they had hoped. Cheers erupted. Officers pounded consoles. Some shouted for the fleet to advance. Others began hailing Rulo already as the savior of the campaign. That is what defiance earns. Crush them, Patriarch. The cult is finished. Their voices carried triumph long before victory had actually arrived. And yet, as those celebrations rose, something strange began revealing itself. The chain destruction slowed, then weakened, then stopped altogether. The divine wave had spent itself. And where Rulo expected thousands of drifting wrecks to remain, only a few ships were actually destroyed. 70 ships. That was all. Only 70 ships had been lost. The rest of the cult armada remained standing. Damaged, shaken, but alive. And as that truth settled over the battlefield, the celebration inside the U-command ships began dying one stunned voice at a time. Starting from Rulo himself. Pant. Pant. Blood spilled from his mouth as internal injuries finally surfaced. Wild disbelief overtook the certainty he had carried into this engagement. No. This cannot be, he muttered, his voice cracking beneath shock. This is impossible. And then, as the fire around Sparrow's destroyed flagship gradually thinned, and the smoke drifting through space began separating in slow spirals, a silhouette emerged. There, still hovering there, his robes hung in burned tatters. The flesh of his upper torso rippled strangely with unstable invisible damage, as though even space around his wounds had not fully settled. His breathing was heavy. His body had paid a price. That much was unmistakable. And yet, despite having endured the wrath of a god and shielding nearly an entire fleet from destruction, he still floated before them as though judgment itself had arrived. Fuck me, you cheeky bastards, how dare you use something so dirty against my men, he muttered, as with every breath he took, his rage seemed to increase progressively. I'm going to show you no mercy, he muttered next, as he finally lifted his gaze and locked it with you. Rulo at a distance. The U-clan patriarch could not understand what Ver was muttering. And yet, just looking into his eyes sent a chill so terrifying down his spine, that he started to visibly shudder. Because in that suspended moment, he understood something terrifying. The rumors surrounding General Sparrow had never been inflated. If anything, they had failed to capture what he truly was. He's a demigod. But that's impossible, but it's right before us. That fucking monster is a demigod. The evil cult has a demigod amongst their ranks, he said in terror, as he rushed to grab the command comms. This is you, Rulo. Lord Kiro, if you hear this message, please come. Save us. The cult has a demigod. Someone has betrayed us. We are screwed. Please come save us, or we will all soon be dead. Meanwhile, Caleb's POV. *BZZZT. *TRRRR. Thud. Caleb, deployed near the front of the cult fleet, saw stray strands of aura from Urulo's orb sweep over his ship, as almost instantly the electrical systems around him began failing in rapid succession, warning runes dimming across control panels while weaker soldiers nearby started collapsing unconscious beneath the crushing residue of divine pressure. Weo-000. Weo-0. Emergency alarms screamed throughout the destroyer as Caleb felt his heart jump into his throat, because all around the forward line, ships had already begun exploding one after another. Boom boom boom. For the first time since deployment, the possibility of death no longer felt theoretical to him, as he stared through the viewing glass and saw entire vessels vanish in fire before his own eyes. Shit, is this it? Caleb wondered, as for one unstable moment even his thoughts nearly slipped into panic while the hull around him groaned under stress. Compared to ships deeper in the rear formation, his vessel sat dangerously near the front, which meant the pressure wave rolling through the fleet struck his position far harder than many others. Panels burst in showers of sparks. Weapon conduits flickered. Navigation arrays collapsed. And once the primary electrical systems died, only the emergency life support matrix powered by reserve mana stones remained, as it somehow strained to maintain breathable air inside the vessel. Pant. Pant. That realization made Caleb's spine run cold, because if an internal surge reached the live weapon cores stored below deck, the destroyer itself could become its own funeral pyre. Not good, this ship may explode at any time. The thought came naturally, and yet as quickly as fear surfaced, discipline forced its way over it, as Caleb remembered something Leo had drilled into him countless times growing up. A frightened officer spreads death. A calm officer contains it. And in that instant, Caleb understood this was not the moment to indulge fear, because too many eyes were already looking toward him for cues on how to react. Everyone stay calm. Backup systems are still functioning and we are going to be fine, Caleb said, forcing firmness into his voice even while his pulse hammered violently inside his chest. The pilot looked toward the burning horizon and pointed with trembling hands. But General Sparrow, his ship, it's destroyed, he said, as even Caleb's stomach lurched hearing that. From where he stood, the flagship really did appear consumed, and for one dangerous second his mind imagined the entire formation collapsing without its spearhead. Yet he crushed that thought immediately, as reason took over. General Sparrow is a demigod, he won't die easily even if his ship explodes, Caleb said, more confidently than he actually felt, as he forced the crew's attention back inward. You focus on us now, seal this cabin, prepare for prolonged electrical failure, and preserve reserve oxygen because emergency systems can sustain life for 48 hours at most. His tone steadied the room in the most important way. Because panic had been inches away, and strangely, once he projected calm, others began borrowing it. The crewmen stopped shouting. Hands returned to consoles. Breathing slowed, as orders that he recently gave out began to be followed. You heard the lieutenant. Seal the cabin. Try to divert more power towards the emergency systems. See if a hard reboot brings any of the electricals back up. The crew talked amongst themselves, while outside, more distant explosions rolled through the fleet. Boom, boom, boom. Several additional ships disappeared in bursts of fire where rogue fragments of the divine attack leaked through, and every blast made the crew instinctively brace for their own turn. If I die here, what would father and mother think? Caleb wondered, as he braced himself for what he believed might be the final moments of his life, while the crippled destroyer drifted amidst chaos and failing systems. However, the worst never came to pass. As slowly, the violence began to weaken and the crushing pressure faded, movement stirred through the floating wreckage ahead, where amidst fire and broken debris, Caleb suddenly caught sight of a lone silhouette suspended in the void. General Sparrow. Alive. For several long breaths nobody inside the bridge spoke, because seeing him emerge from the burning ruin of his flagship felt so unreal that even seasoned crewmen could only stare in stunned silence. Caleb exhaled so hard his knees nearly weakened. "I told you," he muttered, trying and failing to suppress a grin, as relief washed through him so sharply that it almost felt painful. At nearly the same moment, damaged systems across the destroyer began sputtering back to life, as one console flickered awake, then another, then navigation arrays returned, followed by weapons systems crawling back online piece by piece. The pilot blinked in disbelief. "Power is returning." Caleb's expression hardened instantly at those words. "Good, then focus on restoring combat functionality and do it fast. Because this fight is just beginning," he ordered, as hands moved furiously across controls while mana channels reignited, targeting grids rebooted, and shield arrays slowly climbed back toward operational stability. And before the crew could fully process that they had survived the divine strike, the radio erupted. "Charge!" Commander Anderson Silva's voice roared through fleet comms. "Every ship with mobility push forward and finish them all." That single order transformed the atmosphere inside the destroyer almost instantly, as fear turned into momentum, shock hardened into aggression, and beyond Caleb's ship the entire cult line surged forward with sudden purpose. Thousands of warships accelerated together, weapons flaring across the void, as plasma streaks ignited the darkness ahead to punish the U-Clan. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions rolled through space in layered waves as tens of thousands of ships exchanged fire, while streams of energy crossed so densely through the battlefield that the void itself seemed woven from destruction and light. And then Sparrow moved. From the center of that chaos, he unsheathed his sword, and even from this distance Caleb felt the terrifying pressure of aura gathering around the blade before sheeing. A horizontal slash swept across the battlefield with catastrophic force, and where it passed, enemy warships ruptured in cascading annihilation as nearly 1,000 ships vanished in one devastating stroke. Kaboom! The bridge fell silent, while someone whispered almost prayerfully, "What the hell?" Even Caleb could only stare, because although he had always known Ver was monstrous in battle, witnessing such power firsthand felt less like watching a warrior fight and more like watching myth itself. "Operate." Then the pilot shouted over the commotion. "All systems back online." "What are your orders, Lieutenant?" As Caleb's grin returned at once. "Well then what the hell are we waiting for?" he barked. "You heard. The commander. Join the fucking firefight," he ordered, as his own destroyer lurched forward. Weapons hot and ready as they joined the fray. Boom. Their first volley ripped into an enemy cruiser, a second followed almost immediately, then a third, and as enemy return fire streaked past their hull Caleb felt something inside him shift. Earlier he had feared dying. Now he was fighting. Actually fighting. And somehow that fear had transformed into exhilaration. "Target the left flank battery, reload plasma tubes and bring us closer," he shouted, as orders began spilling from him almost instinctively, as though some dormant part of him had awakened. Under fire. Around him the cult advanced as one living organism. Sparrow carved devastation through the vanguard, Silva's fleet pressed ahead mercilessly, and Caleb, in his first true battle, felt the war he had imagined all his life finally become real before him. A few hours later, Planet U Prime, Yukiro's POV. It was only a few hours later that Yukiro finally received Yurulo's last message, which he listened to with a somber expression as the recording echoed through the silent chamber, carrying the desperation of a doomed man. "Please come save us, Lord Kiro. The cult has a demigod within their ranks. The stories about General Sparrow were not rumors but truth, and if you do not come soon we are all going to die." The voice cracked beneath panic before dissolving into static, as the connection with Yurulo's flagship had vanished from that moment onward. Sigh. Yukiro let out a deep sigh, as he weighed those final words with ancient patience. Deep down, he already understood what the broken transmission implied, as there was almost no chance left that his descendant still lived, and although that realization stirred anger within him, the disappointment he felt was even greater. "Rulo, my child, I entrusted you with 2 orbs carrying my power and you still managed to fall. This is not how a patriarch of the U clan should ever perform under pressure. You carry the U banner. Which means you are responsible for its pride." Yukiro muttered coldly, as he clicked his tongue in disgust. "Tisk. You are fortunate you died there, because had you returned alive after such a disgraceful showing, I may have killed you myself." he continued, as harsh judgment came more naturally to him than mourning. His words sounded merciless, yet beneath that severity lingered insult deeper than grief, because while the death of a descendant mattered, the public humiliation of a patriarch dying before the universe mattered even more. But the more pressing matter right now is, how did the cult even gain a new demigod? He muttered next, as his thoughts shifted away from Eurulo entirely and locked onto the true problem now emerging before him, because the existence of this mysterious sparrow disturbed him far beyond the battlefield failure itself. This doesn't make sense. We all agreed to let no new demigods emerge all those years ago, Yukiro muttered, as suspicion began overtaking anger. Because a demigod did not simply appear by accident in this era, not under the structure of the Divine Pact, and certainly not within an enemy force that the Righteous Alliance had spent centuries suppressing. Slowly he rose from his seat as memories stirred regarding the oath the gods forged when the Righteous Alliance first came into being, where they swore no new demigods would arise unless bound in service to the Alliance. That agreement had preserved balance for ages, which was why only Clarence and Terence had emerged in recent centuries through sanctioned approval, while the rest of the universe had remained locked beneath that ceiling. And yet over the last few decades alone, cracks had begun appearing in that order, because first the Sioux clan patriarch somehow reached demigodhood through suspicious means, and now the cult had produced Sparrow. That was no coincidence in Yukiro's eyes, but rather the pattern of a hidden betrayal slowly surfacing, as too many anomalies were beginning to align in one dangerous direction. Only one path should have existed for someone like Sparrow to reach that realm, and it required him to have access to both the flowers of the Eternal Garden and the waters of Granada, while technically neither should have been accessible to the cult. Unless Morris, Caliph, or perhaps both of them have broken the oath and begun enabling this madness behind the Alliance's back, Yukiro muttered, as divine pressure leaked unconsciously into the chamber around him. Because if another god had secretly aided the rise of unauthorized demigods, then this was no longer merely a story of cult resurgence but rather treachery unfolding inside the divine order itself, which enraged him far more than Eurulo's death. Someone was playing a dangerous double game, and worse, someone was feeding strength back into the cult against the shared interests of the great clans and the entire Righteous Alliance. And what unsettled him most was not Sparrow as an individual warrior, because even a demigod could be killed, but rather what Sparrow's existence implied about hidden forces moving beneath the universe's visible order. If the cult could now produce beings at this realm again, then the threat before them was no longer insurgency but restoration, and restoration meant war on a scale the younger minds who had not lived through the chaos era of old could not yet comprehend. I will report this matter before the Great Clan Alliance, Yukiro muttered, as he already began calculating how accusations of betrayal would be framed before the other gods without making himself appear reactive or uncertain. But before that, Rulo's death cannot go unanswered, because if I approach the Alliance now without avenging a fallen patriarch, I appear wounded, weakened, and unfit to command respect. That outcome was unacceptable, because weakness among great clans did not invite sympathy. It invited predators, and so he could not go there looking weak. However, if instead of going there while having just taken a loss, he instead appeared before them carrying Sparrow's severed head, then every clan and every god would understand the Yu clan had not been humbled. It had answered, and that was the message he intended the universe to receive. Crack, crack. Slowly Yukiro cracked his neck and stretched his arms as though preparing not merely for battle, but for judgment itself, while his thoughts sharpened from suspicion into lethal certainty. The objective forming in his mind was no longer simply recapturing planet Satoru or punishing a cult fleet for killing his descendant, because those were now only surface consequences of something much larger. This game had now become about reputation, power, fear, and reminding the universe that the Yu clan was not a name to challenge without inviting extinction in response. It is not Sparrow himself that troubles me most, but rather what his existence means, Yukiro muttered, as his gaze grew colder while the deeper implications continued unfolding before him. Because if one unauthorized demigod existed, then perhaps there could be more, and if more existed, then the cult was no longer a force they could take for granted even after Soren's death. Which was why he decided to act now, before the enemy had even more time to create even more monsters and threaten universal order. A few hours later, planet Satoru, Caleb's POV. A few hours later, on planet Satoru, the atmosphere that Caleb noticed upon landing back from the battle was something that he knew he would never forget for the rest of his life, as while a few soldiers celebrated the successful campaign against the enemy, most others moved through the landing zones in silence, searching desperately for familiar faces that had not returned. The contrast struck him immediately, because celebration and mourning existed side by side without blending, as cheers rose from one corner of the base while, only a few steps away, men stood frozen in place staring at docking logs, hoping that a missing ship would somehow still appear. Among the officers, especially those holding rank at the lieutenant level, the mood leaned heavily toward quiet dissatisfaction, as almost none of them seemed truly pleased with the outcome of the battle despite the victory that had been claimed in orbit. Out of the 10,000 ships that had taken flight to face the U-clan, only 8,000 had returned, which meant that 1 in every 5 ships had been lost in the engagement, and even for a force as large as the cult, that scale of loss could not be dismissed lightly. That number translated into something far more personal on the ground, as every missing vessel represented thousands of soldiers who would never return, and the weight of that realization hung heavily across the entire base. Caleb felt it too as he stepped away from his ship, because although he had focused on survival during the battle itself, standing here now forced him to confront what that survival had cost. Out of the 4 ships that had been placed under his command for the operation, only 3 had made it back intact, while the 4th had been lost somewhere in the chaos beyond the planet's perimeter, taking everyone on board with it. He could not even remember the exact moment it had happened, as the battle had been too chaotic to track every formation properly, and that uncertainty only made the loss feel heavier. Faces came to his mind without warning, fragments of brief conversations, passing interactions, names he had only just begun to learn, and all of them now reduced to silence without even a proper farewell. So this is the truth of military life. Caleb muttered quietly, as the meaning of those words settled deep into his consciousness. As for the first time ever, he realized what it truly meant for commanders above him to decide that they wanted to send a unit to war, and what the cost really was behind the glory the cult was chasing so desperately for generations. The glory we are chasing, just how many lives will it cost before we control the entire universe? He wondered, as for the first time, he realized the folly of the dream that was universal domination. Meanwhile, Leo and Ver's POV. Just like the rest of the soldiers, Ver too felt as though this campaign had been a failure, as he looked toward Leo with visible anger in his eyes and said, 50 million, that is how many lives we lost, Cult Master, 50 fucking million, and no matter how you frame it, that is not a small number to brush aside. Leo listened without interruption as he absorbed the frustration behind those words and gave a slow nod of acknowledgement to show that he did indeed empathize with Ver. However, once a few seconds passed, he let out a deep sigh and said, and yet we killed 5 billion in return, Ver. The enemy fielded a patriarch in a full war fleet, so losses at this scale were always within the range I anticipated. Leo explained, as Ver snorted in anger at his words. That's bullshit and you know it. He muttered, as visible dissatisfaction still lingered on his face. Even then, I feel like I could have reduced it further if you had allowed me to take full control of the battle instead of holding back when it mattered the most. He complained, as Leo's expression remained steady as he met that argument without hesitation and said, so what exactly do you want me to do now? Do you want me to regret the decision? Or try to learn how to reverse the flow of time? Or pretend that we could have fought that battle without paying a price? Ver fell silent for a moment as the weight of that question settled, as Leo continued in the same composed tone, because from where I stand, if you had not been there today, then not a single ship would have returned, and instead of mourning 50 million, we would be mourning an entire army. The words were harsh, yet grounded in reality, as Leo pressed on while keeping his voice controlled. You led them to victory against overwhelming odds, so instead of rejecting that outcome, you should accept it for what it is and understand what it represents. Ver clenched his jaw and listened, as Leo continued without letting the moment drift into emotion. Victory only has value when it is difficult to achieve, because if we remove that hardship, then both the result and the army achieving it become hollow over time. He stepped closer as his tone deepened with quiet conviction. We already discussed this before, we cannot be present in every battle they fight, and if they never experience losses, then the first time reality hits them, and they're thrust into a difficult battle that's going against them, they will break and abandon rank like cowards. Ver's gaze lowered slightly as the logic began settling despite his resistance, as Leo continued, an army that expects perfect victories becomes fragile, because it begins to rely on miracles instead of discipline, and the moment those miracles stop, so does their will to fight. The words carried no hesitation as Leo laid out the broader vision. This is part of a process to build something that can survive without us, because if we fail at that, then everything we are building collapses the moment we are gone. He paused briefly before adding the final point with deliberate weight. The price for universal domination was never going to be light, and everyone who follows us made that choice knowingly, including you, including me, and including every soldier who stepped onto those ships today. Ver remained quiet now, as Leo delivered the final line without softening it. My own son fought in that battle with no special protection, and I gave him the same orders I gave every other soldier. Because that is the only way this force will ever become what we need it to be. Leo held his gaze steady as he concluded, that is the cost of war, there, and whether we like it or not, it is a cost we have already chosen to pay. So you can either swallow the losses like a man and clear your mind for the calamity that is approaching us, or stay grumpy and face a god while being distracted. But either way, within the next 24 hours, Yukiro is coming for you and me, and we have the battle of our lives on our hands. Meanwhile, Planet U Prime, Yukiro's POV. A couple hours after receiving Yurulo's final message, Yukiro finally felt ready to move, as the anger that had previously simmered within him, now settled into a cold and calculated intent to act. Time to teach these damn cult lunatics a lesson in respect, he muttered, as he stepped toward the armor stand and began preparing himself for war. He reached first for his chest plate, as he lifted the heavy piece of engraved metal and secured it across his torso, tightening the clasps to make sure it was a perfect fit. Next, he picked up his pauldrons and locked them over his shoulders, as they reinforced his frame without restricting his movement in the slightest. His gauntlets came next, as he slid his hands into them and flexed his fingers once to test the fit, which was perfect as always. Then came the greaves, as he secured them over his legs and tightened them into position, ensuring that every joint moved smoothly while the armor completed its integration with his body. Once the primary pieces were in place, he reached for a set of compact shield talismans, as they rose from the stand and embedded themselves around him in fixed positions, forming invisible layers of protection that pulsed faintly under his control. Satisfied with his preparation, Yukiro turned toward the final piece resting before him. His spear. He stepped forward and grasped it firmly, as the moment his hand wrapped around the weapon, it responded with a low hum while its energy synchronized with his own, settling into a state of controlled lethality that required no further adjustment. For a brief moment, he stood still, as his thoughts sharpened into singular focus while everything unnecessary faded away. Without another word, he extended his aura outward as space itself began to warp in response, while the boundary between dimensions trembled under the force of his will. Then, with a decisive motion, he tore through the fabric of reality as a fourth-dimensional portal split open before him, its edges burning with compressed energy while the void beyond pulsed faintly in response. FSSHHH. Time to see who you really are, Sparrow, he muttered before stepping in, as he made his way towards Satoru. FWOOSH. A few minutes later, he appeared just outside the atmosphere of planet Satoru, as almost instantly, his unstable aura made the planet's weather patterns change. Even from that distance, his rage caused the upper atmosphere of Satoru to react violently, as thick storm clouds began forming in rapid spirals while powerful winds surged across continents as though the planet itself was struggling to stabilize under his presence. Kaboom! Lightning streaked wildly through the skies without pattern or restraint, as pressure fluctuations rippled across entire regions while oceans below churned unnaturally, responding to a force they could neither understand nor resist. Seconds passed and the disturbance spread further with each passing moment, as wind currents twisted into chaotic streams that uprooted structures and sent debris scattering across cities, while the temperature in several zones dropped sharply under the oppressive weight of his aura. Yukiro remained suspended in space as he observed the reaction without concern, as his mere arrival had already begun bending the environment below him. While responding to his presence, a single demigod shot towards the sky, as Ver floated out to meet the enemy before him, without an ounce of fear in his eyes. "You're disturbing the peace of a planet under my protection," he began, his voice authoritative as he issued an ultimatum to Yukiro. "Restrain your aura at once, and we will talk like civilized men. Don't, and I will show you no mercy," Ver warned, as for a moment, Yukiro felt genuinely confused. The opponent before him was clearly a demigod, and yet, there was not an ounce of fear leaking from his body while he stood against him, as though the man before him did not fear the tier difference between them at all. This was unusual, as while there were few men in the universe with the spine to back talk to a god, there were none that could do so without any fear in their bodies. As for a moment, Yukiro complied and restrained his aura, as if to show respect to his opponent. "Good boy," Ver complimented, as though talking to a dog. However, before he could mutter another word, Yukiro began to laugh in uncontrollable laughter, as he let his aura unfold in full. "Na-na-na-na." Yukiro's laughter echoed across the void as his aura surged outward. Without restraint, as the pressure he released this time was leagues beyond what the planet had endured moments earlier, as almost immediately, the storms below spiraled into complete chaos under its weight. Kaboom! The skies darkened further as lightning split across entire continents. In violent arcs, while the winds intensified into roaring tempests that flattened structures and churned oceans into towering waves, as though the planet itself was buckling under the presence of something it was never meant to host. Ver felt it instantly, the pressure slamming into him, as his body stiffened mid-air while his instincts screamed in warning, because this was no longer a measured display of power but the unfiltered wrath of a true god descending in full. And yet, even under that suffocating weight, he did not step back, as he continued to defiantly maintain eye contact. Yukiro's laughter gradually subsided as his gaze locked onto Ver with something between amusement and irritation, as though the defiance before him was not threatening but offensive. "Have you lost your mind, boy?" he asked, his voice carrying across space as though the vacuum itself bent to transmit it, while his presence loomed like an overwhelming force pressing down from all directions. "Who exactly do you think you are talking to right now, standing there like you belong in the same sky as me?" he continued, as his tone sharpened with each passing word while his grip tightened around his spear. "Yeah, young fucker, listen carefully, because you clearly don't understand the kind of existence you just dared to provoke," Yukiro said, as his eyes narrowed slightly while his aura continued to press down mercilessly. "I am Yukiro, one of the men who betrayed the timeless assassin, the one who stood against Soren himself and buried him beneath the ground. And you are nothing more than a yesterday-born brat who has yet to even understand what true power looks like." His voice carried absolute dominance as he leaned forward slightly in the void, as though even distance itself meant nothing to him while he spoke. "And yet you stand here trying to dictate terms to me," he added, as the sheer absurdity of that idea made him scoff lightly. For a moment, silence followed as the storm below raged uncontrollably while the sky itself seemed to crack under the tension between them. Then slowly, Yukiro lifted his spear and pointed it directly toward Ver. "Since you clearly do not understand your place," he said, as killing intent gathered within his voice while the surrounding space warped under the pressure. "I suppose I will just have to teach you." Yukiro pulled his spear back and pointed it towards Ver, clearly ready to put the upstart demigod in his place, as Ver let out a long sigh and unsheathed his sword in response. Shing Ji. The sword left its scabbard with a clean metallic cry, as Ver pointed it toward Yukiro with mischief gleaming in his eyes, almost as though the overwhelming pressure before him was nothing more than an entertaining challenge. "Sure, you can teach me a lesson," Ver said, his lips curling into a grin as his aura tightened around his body. "But you'll have to catch me first." The moment those words left his mouth, Ver blurred into a streak of speed and shot away from planet Satoru, deliberately pulling the battle deeper into space before Yukiro could unleash anything that would devastate the world below. Yukiro's eyes narrowed slightly, as for a brief moment, the sheer audacity of that retreat made his expression twist into amused disdain. "You seriously think you can outrun me, boy?" Yukiro said, his voice carrying through the void as he moved after Ver without hesitation. The two figures tore through space at speeds that mortal eyes could never hope to follow, their bodies slipping partly through the fourth dimension before emerging back in the third as distance folded beneath them in ways ordinary beings could not comprehend. To the soldiers watching from Satoru, they were no longer humanoid figures, but streaks of violent pressure cutting through the sky like a comet, each movement dragging distorted trails of aura behind them. Within only a few blinks, Ver managed to pull Yukiro nearly 5,000 kilometers away from the planet, and as a result, the crushing pressure boring down on Satoru lessened significantly. However, just as Ver prepared to widen that distance even further, the space before him twisted violently, as Yukiro appeared directly in his path. "Got you now," Yukiro said coldly, as his spear moved with terrifying precision towards Ver's body. Whoosh! Ver's eyes widened as his perception flared at once, a crimson line appearing in his vision that traced the path Yukiro's spear was supposed to take, as it warned him of the attack before it arrived. However, instead of the line holding true, the actual path of the attack diverged significantly, as the spear's actual trajectory did not follow the red line at all. "The fuck? How's that even possible?" Ver wondered, as unlike Leo who had Charles as his master, and who had learned early in life to not trust intent lines blindly, Ver had never had such an experience where the data provided by the intent lines was wrong. And hence, as the information entering his eyes differed from the reality unfolding before him, for a moment, he felt as though the enemy's attack had slipped beyond the predictive framework he relied upon. What to do now? He wondered, as for one dangerous fraction of a second, he almost froze. Yet instinct saved him where perception failed, as he trusted the raw warning screaming through his body and raised his sword into position without thinking. Clang! The spear struck his blade like a falling star. Kaboom! A massive explosion rang through space as the two weapons collided, the shockwave bursting outward in a violent sphere of force that sent fractured ripples tearing across the surrounding void. Pushhhh. Ver was launched backward instantly, his body cutting through space like a broken meteor while his arms went numb from the force of the impact. "The fuck?" Ver muttered through gritted teeth, as pain shot through his shoulders and his fingers almost loosened around his sword. However, thankfully, the divine recovery of the demigod tear mended that damage instantly, as his arms returned to full function. Within a heartbeat. The fuck was that power? He muttered still, as for the first time since ascending to demigod, he realized just how big the gap remained to the last realm. However, before he could think more about it, Yukiro caught up to him again. "Take this," the god said, as he appeared above him, his spear descending towards Ver's temple with a downward jab so sharp that the surrounding space compressed around the tip. Oh no. Ver though, as he barely saw the attack in time, and once again, the red warning line in his vision failed to align perfectly with the spear's actual path. Xing GG. He twisted his sword upward and blocked by instinct alone, meeting the divine spear just before it punched through his skull. However, unfortunately for him, the second collision was even worse than the first, as another explosion erupted between them and sent Ver tumbling downward through space with his body spinning out of control. Clench. His grip on the sword nearly broke this time, as the impact rattled through his bones and made his entire arm feel as though it had been struck by divine lightning. While on the other hand, Yukiro did not look strained at all. He floated above with his spear lowered, his expression calm and utterly unimpressed, as though he had merely corrected an insolent child rather than exchanged blows with a demigod. From only 2 exchanges, the difference between them had become brutally clear. Ver was fast, skilled, fearless. But Yukiro's strength operated on a level that turned every block into punishment, every collision into a disaster, and every successful defense into another injury waiting to deepen. Yet despite the disadvantage, Ver did not panic. As he tumbled backward through space, his thoughts sharpened instead of scattering, because if he could not trust his eyes completely and could not match Yukiro in raw force, then remaining on the same battlefield was suicide. So while falling uncontrollably, he clenched his jaw and tore open a fourth-dimensional pocket beneath him. FSSHHH. The fractured entrance opened like a wound in space, and Ver slipped into it with barely any delay, vanishing from the third-dimensional plane before Yukiro's next strike could arrive. Yukiro watched him disappear with a faint smile, as the god understood exactly what Ver was attempting and found it almost entertaining. "You want to change the battlefield," Yukiro muttered, as he tightened his grip around his spear and stepped toward the opening. "Fine then, brat. Let's see how long you last in a place where running becomes even harder." With that, Yukiro entered the fourth-dimensional pocket after him, as the battle shifted away from ordinary space and into a realm where distance, direction, and timing became far stranger than any mortal battlefield could ever allow. However, what he did not know was that this was exactly Ver's plan. As within the fourth dimension, waited a predator that could actually match Yukiro, blow for blow. Meanwhile, within the fourth dimension, Leo's POV. Leo waited patiently for Ver to drag Yukiro inside the fourth dimension, as this plane offered him advantages that the third dimension never could. The first advantage was secrecy, as the fourth dimension was completely insulated from the prying eyes of other gods, which meant that while a battle in the third dimension could be observed or inferred through divine perception, anything that happened here remained beyond their reach. Within this space, once Yukiro entered fully, even confirming his presence became impossible, as whether he was killed, still alive and fighting, or lost forever within a bottomless void, became impossible to infer from the outside. That ambiguity granted Leo exactly what he wanted, as anonymity and plausible deniability became natural advantages of this battlefield, allowing him to act here without the fear or revealing his new special move to the rest of the universe. As if Yukiro died here today, the suspicion would first fall towards the mysterious General Sparrow, and not towards him. The second advantage was power, as the concentration of divine essence flowing through the fourth dimension was far denser than the third, which meant every movement, every technique, and every execution here carried far greater lethality than it did out there. So for Leo, who intended to use the boss's execution, this environment was ideal, because the technique demanded precision, control, and energy alignment that could be achieved far more reliably within this richer field of essence. The final advantage was instability, as temporal distortions and spatial anomalies were far more common within the fourth dimension than they were in the third, creating a battlefield that continuously shifted in ways most fighters would find disorienting and difficult to navigate. However, for Leo, those irregularities were advantages rather than obstacles, as he had already studied their behavior and understood how to incorporate them into his movements, turning chaos itself into a weapon under his control. And hence, because of all these factors, he had given Ver one very specific instruction before the battle began, which was to drag the Yu clan god into the fourth dimension as quickly as he could, and the two with precise execution. As the only way for them to meet in the fourth dimension reliably, was if Ver opened a portal at precisely 55.5 degrees. As otherwise, even though they were both in the fourth dimension, they could be millions of miles away from one another. Thankfully, that was exactly what Ver did, as only a few minutes after Leo began waiting for Yukiro to appear, Ver dragged the god exactly where Leo wanted, as the dragon executed his duty to perfection. FWOOSH. A fourth-dimensional portal opened before Leo, through which Ver fell first, followed by Yukiro next. Almost as soon as the god appeared, his eyes widened in surprise, as he paused his pursuit of Ver, and pointed his spear towards Leo instead. Swoosh. Yukiro's senses went on high alert, as he made eye contact with Leo and said, You're Leo Skyshard, the damned monster Soren raised, and the new cult master of the evil cult. What are you doing here? And how are you a demigod as well? Yukiro asked, as he looked visibly stunned at the sight before him, because the realization that the cult now possessed two demigods at once did not align with anything he believed to be possible under the current order. What is this? An ambush of some sort? Do you think that just because there are two of you now you can pressure me into submission? Boy, let me make one thing very clear before you misunderstand the situation. Yukiro said, his tone carrying both irritation and cold amusement as he steadied his spear. I have walked battlefields you cannot even comprehend yet, and long before either of you reached this realm, I once fought 5 demigods alone when I was still ascending, and I walked away from that encounter alive without a single lasting wound, Yukiro continued, as his voice deepened with the weight of experience while his aura pulsed steadily around him. For a brief moment, the fourth dimension seemed to still around his presence, as the memory he spoke of carried enough conviction to distort the atmosphere slightly, reinforcing that his words were not empty arrogance but lived reality. Leo listened without interruption, as his expression remained unreadable for a moment before a slow smile spread across his face while he raised his hands and began clapping lightly. Clap, clap, clap. Well, that is quite the achievement, Leo said, as he turned his head slightly toward Ver with an exaggerated look of admiration that carried a clear hint of mockery beneath it. And how are you a demigod as well? Yukiro asked, as he looked visibly stunned at the sight before him. Because the realization that the cult now possessed 2 demigods at once did not align with anything he believed to be possible under the current order. What is this? An ambush of some sort? Do you think that just because there are 2 of you now you can pressure me into submission? Boy, let me make one thing very clear before you misunderstand the situation. Yukiro said, his tone carrying both irritation and cold amusement as he steadied his spear. I have walked battlefields you cannot even comprehend yet, and long before either of you reached this realm, I once fought 5 demigods alone when I was still ascending, and I walked away from that encounter alive without a single lasting wound, Yukiro continued, as his voice deepened with the weight of experience while his aura pulsed steadily around him. For a brief moment, the fourth dimension seemed to still around his presence, as the memory he spoke of carried enough conviction to distort the atmosphere slightly, reinforcing that his words were not empty arrogance but lived reality. Leo listened without interruption, as his expression remained unreadable for a moment before a slow smile spread across his face while he raised his hands and began clapping lightly. Clap, clap, clap. Well, that is quite the achievement, Leo said, as he turned his head slightly toward Ver with an exaggerated look of admiration that carried a clear hint of mockery beneath it. General Sparrow, did you hear that? He fought 5 demigods and escaped alive while he was at the same tier. That is quite the tale, isn't it? Should we start fawning over him? Leo continued, as his tone remained casual while his eyes gleamed with amusement. You were there on the pit when I fought those monarchs, weren't you, General Sparrow? So tell me something. How many did I kill alone while being at the monarch stage? Leo asked, as he tilted his head slightly while waiting for the answer. Ver pretended to think for a moment, as though carefully recalling the event, before responding in a calm and matter-of-fact tone that carried no hesitation. Thousands, Cult Master, you killed thousands alone, Ver said, as his lips curved faintly while he delivered the number with quiet satisfaction. A sharp grin spread across Leo's face at that response, as he turned his gaze back toward Yukiro with an expression that no longer bothered to hide its provocation. You heard him, I killed thousands, so you might want to think carefully about who you were talking to before you start throwing around your old war stories like they mean something here, Leo said, as his voice carried a casual confidence that bordered on complete disregard. To me, your accomplishments are nothing more than warm-up acts. That I can perform in my sleep, so if you are trying to intimidate us, then you are wasting your time, he added, as his eyes sharpened slightly while the air around him grew subtly heavier. Without breaking eye contact, Leo reached into his inventory and pulled out 2 ordinary daggers, as the blades appeared unremarkable at first glance, yet the way he held them made it clear. They were extensions of his intent. He shifted into a relaxed yet precise battle stance, as his posture settled into something deceptively loose while every muscle aligned for immediate movement the moment the fight began. Stop yapping, old man. If you want to fight then fight, and if you want to prove your superiority then do it with your spear instead of your mouth, Leo said, as his tone dropped into something colder while his gaze locked onto Yukiro completely. There is no need to waste breath on us, because if you truly believe you can take us both down at once, then come forward and show us, he continued, as a faint smirk returned to his lips. Let's see whether you can actually do it, or whether 2 so-called upstart demigods are enough to send you back wondering where it all went wrong, Leo finished, as his aura flared to its peak around him, as he braced for battle. The 4th dimension. Clench. Tremble. Listening to Leo disrespect him so blatantly, Yukiro felt his anger flare violently within his chest, as he tightened his grip on his spear while his aura surged outward in response to the insult. All right, you loudmouth, since you want to see the gap between heaven and earth, let me educate you properly, Yukiro said, as he lunged forward with his spear aimed directly at Leo's heart. Whoosh! He moved with the overwhelming speed of a god, as space folded beneath his advance while the spear in his hand gathered an insane amount of divine essence at its tip. Yet what followed defied his expectations completely, as the moment the spear reached striking range, Leo shifted slightly and let the attack pass beside him as though the motion had unfolded in slow motion before his eyes. Pass. There was no strain in his movement, no desperate evasion, as he sidestepped the thrust with minimal displacement while maintaining perfect balance, as though he had already known exactly where the attack would land. What? Yukiro thought in panic, as his eyes narrowed, his mind unable to accept this absurd outcome as he continued the motion without pause, chaining the first thrust into a relentless sequence of stabs that pierced forward one after another without giving Leo space to breathe. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Each strike came layered with deceptive intent, as the trajectory of his spear shifted mid-motion while his aura masked the true direction of his attacks, creating patterns even seasoned gods struggled to interpret correctly. And yet, Leo moved through it all effortlessly, as he slipped between every incoming strike with the smallest possible adjustments, his body weaving through the barrage with a level of control that made the entire exchange look almost unreal. Dodge. There was no wasted motion in his defense, as every step, every tilt, and every shift aligned perfectly with the flow of the attacks, making it seem as though Yukiro's assault had been rehearsed rather than unleashed in real combat. What in the actual hell? Yukiro thought, as for the first time since entering the battlefield, a flicker of disbelief surfaced within his mind while the impossibility of what he was witnessing began to settle in. Even if Leo could perceive intent, predicting the exact landing point of his attacks should have been impossible, as his technique was built upon layered deception that disrupted even divine-level perception. And yet that logic failed him here, as every strike he delivered continued to miss by margins too precise to dismiss as coincidence, forcing him to acknowledge that something far deeper was at play. Is he using some secret cult technique I'm not aware of? He wondered, as he tried to search for a theory that could justify this absurdity unfolding before him. However, while he did that, Ver acted without hesitation, as from his blind spot a blade cut through the distorted space behind him with sharp and deliberate timing. Shing! The shift forced Yukiro to pivot instantly, as he turned to intercept the incoming strike while bringing his spear across his body to block the attack that threatened to slice into his flank. Block! The collision rang through the fourth dimension with violent force, as the impact sent ripples through the surrounding space, while Leo transitioned immediately from dodging to attack, as he tried to make the most of the opening that Ver had created for him. Shing! He attacked Yukiro without delay, pressing into his defense from the other side, as he forced the god into a narrow window where blocking and retreating was his only option. Block. Run. Without hesitation, Yukiro activated one of his defensive talismans, as an invisible barrier formed around him and absorbed Leo's attack, while he himself ran immediately, as he disengaged from the exchange and retreated to create distance while reassessing the situation with a gaze that had now grown noticeably sharper. For the first time since the battle began, he understood that this was not a confrontation he could resolve through dominance alone, as the assumptions he had carried into the fight no longer held true. General Sparrow. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't someone going to teach us a lesson in respect? Leo said from the side, as his tone carried open mockery while he observed Yukiro with contempt in his eyes. Yeah, Cult Master, I thought someone was going to humble us, but looking at his face, I think someone else got humbled instead, there. Replied, as a quiet chuckle escaped him while Yukiro's expression darkened further. For a moment, there was silence, as the tension between them stretched across the unstable fabric of the fourth dimension, as neither side moved. Until, enough, Yukiro roared at last, as his voice tore through the void while his aura surged violently outward, expanding to its absolute peak as the faint shade of red around him deepened into something far darker. FWOOSH. The pressure around him intensified with each passing second, as both Leo and Ver watched the shift carefully while the change in his aura made it clear that his emotional stability was beginning to fracture under the weight of his anger. On most days, Yukiro was not a man bound by false bravado, as he had never hesitated to retreat against opponents he deemed dangerous, and in past battles against other gods, survival had always taken precedence over pride. However, this situation was different, as the opponents before him were not gods but demigods, and even if this battle turned against him, he did not feel any threat being posed to his life facing them. That distinction mattered, because while fear could have overridden his pride in the face of true danger, here there was only insult, and insult alone was not something Yukiro had ever learned to tolerate. Quietly. And so, as that anger burned unchecked within him, his thoughts simplified into something far more dangerous, as the only question left in his mind was how to eliminate both enemies standing before him without delay. And that reaction was exactly what Leo had been waiting for. As from the very beginning of the encounter, he had chosen not to reveal the origin blade in his possession too early, precisely because exposing that weapon would have introduced a level of threat that would have made Yukiro turn more careful. With there being a chance that the god retreated and ran for his life. Once he realized that there was real danger of him taking permanent damage. So instead, Leo had chosen restraint, as he allowed the fight to unfold naturally while carefully guiding Yukiro deeper into the engagement, ensuring that pride anchored him in place rather than caution pulling him away. The longer the battle continued, the more Yukiro committed himself to it, the closer Leo felt to achieving victory, as he predicted that the longer they fought, the more chances he would get to unleash his ultimate move. Which was why, as he watched Yukiro's aura spiral further into instability, his mind remained calm and focused on a single objective, which was to create the opening he needed to unleash the boss's execution, and end this fight, for once and for all. The fourth dimension. Once Yukiro decided to get completely serious, the tone of the battle shifted immediately, as gone were the probing exchanges that tried to establish his dominance through raw speed and strength alone, and in their place emerged techniques that had carved his legend across centuries of war. Heaven rend pierced Yukiro intoned, as his spear drew back while the surrounding fourth-dimensional space bent inward toward its tip like a collapsing star. Whoosh! He thrust forward, as the strike tore through reality itself while a spiraling cone of compressed divine essence surged outward, threatening to erase everything along its path. Leo's eyes sharpened instantly, as he stepped forward instead of retreating while activating Enhance, his muscles surging with amplified strength as he raised his daggers to meet the incoming force. Clang! Block! The impact detonated across the void, as shockwaves rippled outward violently while Leo's arms trembled under the sheer pressure of the strike before he redirected it just enough to not pick damage. Yukiro is still stronger than me when it comes to skill output, but the gap between us is not a chasm. It's manageable for sure, Leo calculated, as his feet slid back slightly through warped space while his control held firm against the overwhelming force. Block that. How about you try to block this next? Yukiro said, as he was about to chain another attack. However, before he could do so, Ver appeared from the side with his blade already in motion, as he slashed toward the god's flank with perfect timing. Shing! Yukiro pivoted instantly to block, yet the moment his spear intercepted Ver's strike, Leo re-entered the exchange from the opposite angle without hesitation. Whoosh! Slash! Leo slipped forward using Fade Step, his body phasing through a narrow distortion in space as he closed the distance and struck toward Yukiro's exposed side. Block! Yukiro raised a defensive talisman in time, yet the force of Leo's strike still forced him to shift position slightly, breaking the flow of his counterattack before it could fully form. Step! Step! That single disruption was all it took to shift the balance, as from that moment onward the rhythm of the battle refused to settle in Yukiro's favor again, with every attempt he made to build momentum being cut short by either Leo or Ver stepping in at precisely the right instant. They moved as though guided by a shared instinct rather than coordination alone, their actions flowing seamlessly into one another as pressure remained constant and the battlefield never once opened enough for Yukiro to establish control over the exchange. This is absurd, Yukiro thought, as frustration began creeping into his focus while his spear carved through the battlefield in increasingly aggressive patterns. Void Spiral Breaker, he roared, as his weapon spun with terrifying speed while tearing open layered distortions that twisted the fourth dimension into a collapsing vortex. WHRRRRR. The attack surged outward unpredictably, as space fractured into shifting planes that would have disoriented even seasoned gods. Yet Leo moved through it calmly, as his perception adapted to the distortions while he threaded his path between collapsing fragments as though he understood the laws of space better than even Yukiro. Whoosh! At the same time, Ver dove through the unstable field from above, as he adjusted mid-motion to align with the shifting geometry before striking downward with full force. Mountain-splitting slash. Shing! Yukiro blocked again, yet the moment his spear met Ver's blade, Leo was already there, as he slipped into range and drove a dagger toward Yukiro's ribs. Block. Another talisman shattered under the pressure, as Yukiro was forced to disengage once more while his aura flared violently around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he had not expected to feel here. Pressure. Not the kind that threatened his life, but the kind that denied him control, and forced him to take a battle more seriously than he would have wanted. Individually, they fall short, Yukiro thought, as his gaze sharpened while he reassessed the battlefield with growing irritation. But together, they are disrupting everything. He assessed, as opposite him, Leo also came to a similar conclusion. I can feel it clearly, Leo thought, as he deflected another strike, while adjusting his stance to maintain balance. I'm still just short of matching a god alone, unless I use the laws and start using Second's Walk. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ver. But together, we control the pace. That realization grounded him, as he pressed forward once again. Without hesitation. From the other side, Ver felt the intensity building with every exchange, as his body pushed against limits he had never fully reached before. Right now, he was operating at a level that he had never expected, as each strike from him demanded a level of commitment that he wasn't completely sure of, and each mistake carried with it a consequence he wasn't sure he could pay. This is it, Ver thought, as he parried another attack while shifting into position for the next exchange. This is the absolute limit of what I can do. His breathing remained steady, yet his awareness sharpened to an extreme, as the fight forced everything out of him in its entirety. Still, he did not falter. Because as long as Leo remained in sync with him, the battle remained balanced. And as long as the balance held, Yukiro could not win. Whoosh *shing *clang. The battlefield roared with continuous collisions, as divine techniques clashed against coordinated precision while the fourth dimension itself warped violently under their exchange. As the longer the fight went on, the more desperate Yukiro grew to break the stalemate and establish dominance. I am a goddamn it. I should not struggle against mere demigods. Is this what I'm reduced to? Is this the true limit of my strength? Yukiro wondered, as he felt himself incapable of accepting the outcome that he could not even overpower two demigods alone. Which was why he started to take increasingly bolder risks. Risks that he would usually avoid. Risks that could potentially give Leo the opening he was waiting for. One day ago, Planet Satoru, Leo and Ver's POV. Wait, so when you look at me and throw that X sign, that means it's time to end the fight? Ver asked, as he leaned back slightly in his chair while swirling the drink in his hands, as opposite him, Leo nodded while taking a slow sip of his drink. Yes, when I throw the X sign, both you and the enemy will see it, and the enemy's mind will immediately begin racing to interpret what it means. Leo explained, as his eyes lit up as he began to lay out the nuances of his plan. He will assume that it is a signal to initiate something that is pre-planned between us, and that assumption alone will force him into a state of heightened caution, because uncertainty always makes even powerful opponents hesitate, Leo continued, as Ver listened closely. And once you see the sign, you respond by saying that. Oh, Cult Master, I was thinking the same thing. Which reinforces his suspicion that something coordinated is about to unfold. Leo added, as a faint smile formed on his lips. So, he will become cautious and get into a defensive shape, which is natural, however, that pause is exactly what we are aiming for. Leo said, as his eyes sharpened slightly. Ver nodded in understanding, though his expression grew more serious as he began to grasp the deeper implications behind the plan being laid out before him. So you create that hesitation, buy yourself time, and then what happens next? Ver asked, as he took a sip of his drink, fully invested in this plan now, as Leo placed his drink aside and folded his hands calmly, while his gaze grew distant for a brief moment as he visualized the sequence he intended to execute. Before I can use my final move, I need a moment away from direct pressure, because I must spread my aura thinly across the battlefield and map the temporal and spatial distortions around me, Leo explained, as his voice lowered slightly. That process cannot be rushed, and if I attempt it while being actively pressured, even a minor miscalculation could cause the entire execution to fail, he added, as Ver's brows furrowed slightly. That is why the X sign matters, because even though the enemy becomes cautious, that caution buys me the exact window I need to complete my preparation, Leo continued, as he tapped his fingers lightly. Ver exhaled slowly as he absorbed that, before nodding again and asking the question that mattered most in that moment. All right, so you get your time, you prepare your move, and then what do I do? Ver asked, as his tone carried both readiness and curiosity. Leo looked directly at him this time, as his expression turned sharper while the final piece of the plan was revealed. The moment I give the signal, you begin gathering as much divine essence as you possibly can, and then you unleash the strongest attack you are capable of, Leo said, as his voice carried quiet authority. That attack must be overwhelming enough to demand his full attention, because while he is focused entirely on stopping you, I will switch my dagger with the origin blade and prepare my own strike, Leo explained, as the plan came together fully. Ver remained silent for a few seconds after hearing that, as the weight of what Leo was asking began settling into his mind. This does not leave much room for error, Ver said at last, as his tone grew heavier while he considered the risks involved. If I commit everything into that attack and you fail to end the fight, not only do we expose the origin blade, but we also leave ourselves drained and vulnerable, he continued, as his gaze remained fixed on Leo. Leo nodded without hesitation, as he had already considered every outcome that Ver had just laid out. That is exactly why I will not throw the sign until I am absolutely certain of what I am doing, Leo said, as his voice remained steady and grounded. I understand my own limits well enough, but I cannot assume the same for an enemy god, which is why we will spend the first part of the fight probing him carefully, Leo continued, as his tone carried controlled patience. Only once I have a complete picture of his abilities will I make that call, and when I do, you can trust that the desired outcome is already within reach, he added, as his gaze sharpened further. Ver held that gaze for a moment before a confident smile slowly formed across his face, as he leaned back once more with renewed certainty. In that case, you can count on me to put everything I have into that strike, Ver said, as his tone carried unwavering conviction. Even if it costs me my own life essence, I will make sure he has no choice but to focus on me, he added, as Leo gave a small nod in acknowledgement. Present moment, the fourth dimension, Leo and Ver's POV. After nearly 25 minutes of continuous combat, Leo finally felt that he had reached the point he had been waiting for, as Yukiro's patterns, speed, and capabilities had all been mapped within his mind to a sufficient degree. While there were still unknown variables that could surface at any moment, Leo judged that he now possessed enough understanding to commit to ending the fight. General Sparrow, Leo called out, as his voice cut through the chaos of the battlefield while his gaze locked onto Ver. In the same instant, he raised his hand and formed the X sign clearly in front of both his ally and his opponent, as the gesture carried unmistakable intent. Ver saw it immediately, and smiled. Got it, Cult Master, Ver replied without hesitation, as his tone remained calm while his eyes gleamed with anticipation. I was thinking the same thing myself, he added, as his response followed the script perfectly. Across from them, Yukiro's expression shifted instantly, as his gaze snapped between the two while suspicion flared within his mind. What are you two little devils planning now? Yukiro demanded, as his grip on his spear tightened while his aura surged defensively around him. However, even as he spoke, his attention was already being drawn toward Ver, as the demigod's presence began to change in a way that could not be ignored. Ver's aura began condensing rapidly, as an absurd amount of divine essence started gathering within his body, compressing into a density that warped the surrounding fourth-dimensional space. FWOOSH. The energy around him thickened visibly, as the pressure began rising with every passing second while the battlefield itself seemed to react to the buildup. And in that moment, Yukiro's focus shifted towards him completely, exactly as planned, giving Leo the window he needed to spread his aura thin and map out the battlefield around him. The fourth dimension. Just as Leo intended, for a few crucial seconds after he threw the X sign, Yukiro's attention shifted entirely toward Ver, as between the two of them, Ver now appeared to be the more immediate threat. ARGHHHHHH. Ver roared, as divine essence surged violently through every inch of his body while he gathered power for his ultimate move, the surrounding fourth dimension warping under the sheer intensity of the buildup. For a brief moment, Yukiro considered stepping in to interrupt the process before it could reach completion, as instinct told him that allowing such an attack to fully form would be dangerous. Yet just as he resolved to move, a subtle shift behind him forced his attention elsewhere, as he turned to find Leo watching him with a quiet, sinister smile that carried unsettling intent. "Go on, attack Sparrow, disrupt his rhythm," Leo encouraged calmly, as his tone carried deliberate provocation that only deepened Yukiro's uncertainty in that moment. Why does he want me to attack Sparrow? Is that the trap? Yukiro wondered, as that single hesitation fractured his decision-making, as doubt crept in where certainty should have remained, leaving him caught between two choices that both carried risk. On one side stood Ver, gathering overwhelming power that demanded immediate interruption, while on the other stood Leo, whose composure suggested something far more dangerous hidden beneath the surface. And in that brief window of indecision, Yukiro failed to act. Which was exactly what Leo wanted. Because those few stolen seconds were all Ver needed. Dragon's justice. Ver yelled, as he gripped his sword with both hands and brought it down in a decisive arc, releasing a slash that looked exactly like a colossal dragon tearing through the void. Roar rrrr. A voice tore through the fourth dimension, as the slash expanded instantly into a roaring manifestation of draconic force, its body coiling and twisting as though alive while surging forward with overwhelming intent. She tremble. Its presence alone warped the fourth dimension around it, as layers of space peeled back under its passage while the sheer density of divine essence within the attack made the battlefield tremble. Yukiro's gaze hardened the moment he saw it, as instinct took over while he planted his spear firmly before him and activated his best defensive move without hesitation. Complete defense, Yukiro said, as he extended his spear outward while channeling divine essence into its tip, turning it into the focal point of a massive protective barrier. FWOOM. A radiant shield formed instantly, as concentric layers of compressed energy spread outward from the spear's tip while stabilizing into a dense structure meant to absorb incoming force, as the dragon slash struck it head-on. Boom! The collision shook the battlefield violently, as the roaring force of Dragon's justice pressed against the shield without dispersing, continuing to grind forward as though determined to break through by sheer persistence. For a moment, the defense held. Then the pressure began to build. Yukiro's body was pushed backward through space despite his stance, as the force of the attack drove him inch by inch across the battlefield while his aura flared intensely to reinforce the barrier. CRRRAAAACK. A faint crack appeared at the spear's tip. Then another. The fractures spreading out slowly, as the continuous pressure of the attack began overwhelming the structural integrity of the shield. Clench. Yukiro gritted his teeth as he poured more power into the defense, yet the dragon continued to roar against it without losing momentum. Hold, he growled, as strain crept into his voice. The cracks deepened, the shield trembled, and then, shatter. The barrier collapsed. As the remaining force of the attack surged through and struck Yukiro directly, the impact slamming into his chest plate with explosive intensity. Boom! His armor dented under the contact, as a deep, burning cut formed across its surface while the force of impact sent him flying backward through the void. Only after several seconds did he stabilize, as lingering energy from the strike dissipated slowly around him. The hell, he muttered, completely stunned by the force Ver was able to produce, as for the first time since the battle began, he felt a tiny fear for his life. How did a mere demigod unleash such a strong attack? He wondered, as he looked towards Ver, who looked half asleep now, his posture slouching, as though he had no more energy left in his body. Did you seriously use everything you had in this one strike? Did you not know that gods can't be killed by normal attacks? Did you not understand that even if you split me in half, I still wouldn't die? Yukiro asked, as he started to gather divine essence of his own to attack Ver, when finally Leo joined the fray, appearing above him in a flash that bent space without warning. Flash. Leo materialized just above him, as for a split second Yukiro's senses failed to register his presence, and by the time awareness caught up, the blade was already descending. Block. Their weapons collided violently, as this time Yukiro felt something far more dangerous than before, because murderous intent leaked from every inch of Leo's being with suffocating intensity. He appeared above me, but I could not even sense his movement. Yukiro thought, feeling alarmed. However, before he could even recover from that shock, Leo vanished again, as his form blurred out of existence before reappearing behind Yukiro in the same instant, defying spatial continuity entirely. Flash. Block. Another strike came from his blind side, as Yukiro twisted just in time to intercept it, though the force still pushed his weapon dangerously close to his own body, as this time it seemed as though Leo was even closer to breaching his defense than before. Clench. The edge of his own blade brushed against his armor, as alarm bells rang violently in his mind, because what he was witnessing now resembled something far beyond ordinary demigod capability. Huh, Yukiro muttered, as his thoughts struggled to catch up while Leo disappeared once more, this time reappearing directly in front of him with a dagger aimed cleanly at his throat. Whoosh! Tilt! He leaned back just enough to avoid the cut, as the blade sliced past his neck by a margin so small it sent a chill down his spine. As it was in that instant, that realization struck him fully. This was not sheer speed. This was not teleportation or a mere skill move. This was something else entirely. You know how to perform the second's walk. Yukiro muttered, disbelief seeping into his voice as he stared at Leo with widening eyes. Leo paused, as he tilted his head slightly before shaking it with calm indifference, as he kept one hand casually folded behind his back, while extending the other towards Yukiro as though this exchange was nothing but a practice spar for him. No, but I do know how to kick your butt. So if you want me to educate you properly about the gap between you and me. Come, he taunted, as he gestured for Yukiro to come at him if he dared. For a moment, Yukiro did not move, his mind calculating the risk-to-reward ratio of pursuing this fight anymore. Then his expression hardened. Right now, you are just within the threshold of someone I can still defeat by myself, Yukiro muttered, as his aura surged again while murderous resolve replaced hesitation. But if you truly possess something even remotely similar to the second's walk, then I cannot allow you to leave this battlefield alive. He declared, as his grip tightened around his spear, and his own aura flared. FWOOSH. Divine essence gathered violently around his spear tip, as spiraling currents condensed into a focused drill of destructive force that distorted the fourth dimension around it. Divine drilling, Yukiro intoned, as he lunged forward with lethal precision, aiming to pierce straight through Leo's heart in a single decisive strike. However, what he did not realize was that this charge marked the beginning of his end, as Leo was already ready to use the boss's execution. Exhale. Leo exhaled sharply. Parallel processing already active in his brain, as he saw Yukiro approaching in slow motion. This is it. If he comes any closer, his death will become an inevitability. Leo thought, as his grip tightened on the origin metal dagger he held behind his back, as he waited for the perfect moment to diverge the flow of time and trigger the start of the boss's execution. Patience. Time it to perfection. You've got this. Don't rush it now, Leo reminded himself, as he waited and waited and waited till the last possible moment, before disappearing, as Yukiro's spear thrust into empty space where Leo was supposed to be, and yet, wasn't. The fourth dimension, a couple seconds ago. For Yukiro, the moment looked simple, as Leo stood before him with calm eyes while divine drilling tore toward his heart with enough force to pierce through any normal demigod. However, that was only what his eyes perceived, because at the final possible instant, Leo split the stream of time for less than a heartbeat and stepped outside the outcome Yukiro believed he had locked in. Pulse. To Yukiro, Leo was still there. But in reality, he was already gone. As his spear thrust forward with perfect precision, divine essence roaring around its tip as it drilled through the exact spot where Leo's chest should have been, only to meet nothing but empty fourth-dimensional space. Stab. Yukiro's eyes widened instantly, because the resistance he expected never came, and the absence of impact told him something had gone wrong before his mind could fully understand how. Impossible. That thought flashed through him just as the first phase revealed its true cruelty, because Leo had not merely escaped Yukiro's attack, but had replaced his position with something far more dangerous. BZZTTT. A compressed gravitational orb now floated where Leo had stood, its surface black and unstable, as the fourth dimension around it bent inward with increasing violence. Yukiro tried to retreat immediately, his instinct screaming at him to pull away from the distortion before it completed whatever function Leo had prepared for it. However, the orb activated before his body could fully obey. Gravity pull. The force dragged him inward with brutal insistence, as his forward momentum from divine drilling combined with the gravitational pull from the orb ruined his balance completely, forcing him to follow through till the end, as he found himself struggling to turn. BOOOOM. The gravitational orb collapsed into itself and detonated outward, releasing a violent burst of warped pressure that swallowed Yukiro's immediate surroundings in darkness and distortion. Dizzy. It was not an attack designed to kill him. It was an attack designed to rob him of control, as his senses blurred and his spear arm jolted, while his footing vanished inside a battlefield where footing should not even matter, as directional stability itself became meaningless for one precious fraction of time. And in that exact fraction, Leo appeared behind him, ready to strike. Flash. This time, there was no hesitation in Leo's body, no testing movement, and no probing strike meant to gather information about the god's limits. As he had already done that in the events leading up to this moment, as now, he executed the fastest possible strike he was capable of, and the two from an angle that he knew would grant him success. Slash. His body accelerated beyond the level he had shown earlier, as he moved nearly 20% faster than the probing exchanges he had earlier, as he went straight for Yukiro's head. Whoosh. For a moment, space stretched. Time thinned, and the origin dagger hidden in his grip finally revealed itself, its edge cutting through the surrounding essence with a silence more terrifying than any roar. As by the time Yukiro sensed it, it was already too late. Splat. A coldness touched the back of his neck, and in that final instant, every warning instinct in his body erupted at once. This was danger. Real danger. The kind of danger even a god could not ignore. As in his final moments, he desperately tried to turn, to raise his spear, or to escape the fourth dimension and return to the third. However, unfortunately, before he could do any of them, Leo completed his move. The boss's execution. Slice. There was no grand explosion when the origin dagger met flesh, because the blade did not need spectacle to prove its power. It simply cut through divine aura, through reinforced flesh, through the neck of a god who had spent millennia believing that his end would never come. As in the end, Yukiro's head separated from his body in one smooth motion, as the entire sequence from Leo's disappearance to the final slash lasted barely a second and a half. For a heartbeat, the fourth dimension seemed to fall silent. Yukiro's decapitated head drifted through the void, his eyes still open as disbelief remained frozen across his face. As he saw Leo first, then the origin dagger in his hands, and only then did understanding finally reach him. Origin metal. The thought arrived with horror so deep that it swallowed every trace of arrogance he had carried into the battle. This was not a normal wound. This was not something he could simply regenerate from. This was death. Real death. The kind of death he never thought he would face because of how cunning he was. Which was why, in his final moments, his expression changed slowly as his head continued to drift, disbelief collapsing into raw terror while the truth settled into the final fragments of his consciousness. I was killed, not by Soren, not by the timeless assassin, not even by Kalith or Morris, but some brat not even born a full 100 years ago. He thought, as he felt ashamed, humbled and terrified all at once. While opposite him, Leo lowered the origin dagger with a calm expression, as though the killing of a god had been nothing more than the inevitable conclusion of a move performed correctly. The boss's execution, Leo muttered softly, his breathing heavy but his eyes bright with cruel satisfaction. Remember the name of the move that sent you to the afterlife, you worthless scum. He said at last, as those became the final words that Yukiro the great patriarch of the Yu clan heard before his death. As although he tried to open his mouth to say a final few words, the blood gurgling up from his neck made it impossible to form coherent speech, as in the end, he died with blood leaking from his lips, and his eyes wide with surprise, just like any common warrior. The fourth dimension. For a moment after chopping off Yukiro's head, Leo remained where he stood, drawing slow, controlled breaths as he watched the decapitated head drift through the void, its eyes closing at last as the final traces of the great god's will faded into nothingness. Even then, his anger had not fully settled, as it lingered beneath the surface while his senses stayed sharp and alert, because although the battle had ended, the surge of adrenaline still held his body in a state between combat and calm. However, that tension began to loosen the moment his gaze shifted, as when he looked toward Ver, the sight before him broke through the lingering edge of battle and pulled him back into the present. Ha 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 ha. Ver laughed wildly in the distance, doubling over himself as he pointed first at Yukiro's lifeless body and then toward Leo, his reaction raw, unfiltered, and completely unable to contain what they had just accomplished. What the fuck, what the actual fuck? Ver burst out, his voice echoing wildly through the distorted space as he clutched his forehead with one hand while shaking his head in disbelief. You really did it, you crazy motherfucker, you actually killed a god. He continued, his laughter breaking into uneven bursts as though even he could not process the reality unfolding before him. Yukiro is dead, that old demon, that bastard who terrorized the cult for 2 millennia, he's gone. Ha ha ha, I can't believe this shit. Ver said, his laughter turning breathless as he widened his eyes, still trying to grasp the scale of what they had just accomplished. As watching him, Leo could not help it either. A genuine smile spreading across his face as well, as, hey, ha, ha ha ha, Leo chuckled softly at first, as the sound grew gradually while the tension inside him finally released, turning into genuine laughter as he shook his head slightly. Ha ha, what a mess, he muttered under his breath, as his shoulders relaxed for the first time since the battle had begun. For a brief moment, the two of them simply laughed. No pressure, no enemies, no expectations, just victory and brotherhood, as the absurd realization of what they had pulled off together finally hit them. Ha ha ha, we actually did it. Fuck, I did not want to say it before, but I actually came into this battle believing it to be my last. Ha ha ha, I was ready to die beside you today. And I didn't really think we could actually win till we did. Ver said, his voice still carrying disbelief as he wiped at his face, as though trying to ground himself back into reality. And the best part, bloody nobody knows. He added, his grin stretching wide as he looked toward Leo, as the weight of that secret settled between them. Only the two of them knew that Yukiro was dead. And for now, it would stay that way. For a while, Ver simply looked at Yukiro's body and then back towards Leo, as he continued to clap and laugh as though he had genuinely lost his mind. Until, after a few more moments, Ver finally managed to steady himself, though a faint chuckle still lingered in his breath as he looked at Leo with curiosity burning behind his eyes. But seriously, what the hell was that last move? He asked, still half laughing as he shook his head again. I couldn't track you at all, not even for a second. What in the blue hell was that? He asked, as Leo exhaled slowly before answering, his tone calmer now, though the exhaustion beneath it was unmistakable. The boss's execution, it's my ultimate move, kind of like Soren's second's walk, he said simply, as he rolled his shoulders slightly to ease the strain in his body. Ver blinked, then let out another short burst of laughter. Huh, yeah, that's a damn impressive move, he said, nodding slowly as he looked back toward the space where Yukiro had died. One I really hope you never decide to use on me, he added with a crooked grin. Leo smirked faintly at that. Well, the dragon's justice wasn't bad either, he replied, his tone carrying genuine acknowledgement as his eyes flicked toward Ver. What the hell was that? That's not something the cult taught you, where did you pull that from? He asked, as Ver raised an eyebrow at the question, a knowing smile creeping onto his face as he crossed his arms loosely. Well, cult master, he said, his tone playful now. You have your secrets, he continued, tilting his head slightly. I have mine. For a second, Leo stared at him. Then, ha. Both of them burst into laughter again, the sound louder this time, as whatever weight remained from the battle finally dissolved completely. Step. Still chuckling, Leo began walking toward Ver, though his steps were noticeably slower now, his body heavy from the exertion despite the absence of any real injuries. And when he reached him, he didn't stop. Instead, he simply leaned, placing an arm over Ver's shoulder, as he let his full weight rest against him without warning. Grab. Whoa, hey, what the hell? Ver protested immediately, staggering half a step as he tried to adjust. You fucker, I'm more tired than you, if anyone should be getting carried here, it should be me, he complained, though the grin on his face betrayed his lack of seriousness. TCH. Leo clicked his tongue lightly. Nah, I'm the cult master, you're just General Sparrow, so I get VIP service. Leo replied, as he pulled rank before shifting his weight slightly more onto him. You just focus on staying upright and serving your cult master well. He commanded, as for a moment, Ver stared at him in disbelief. Then, ha, you piece of shit. Ha, fine, don't fall over then. He chuckled, as their laughter echoed once more through the fourth dimension, unrestrained and genuine, as for the first time since stepping onto this battlefield, both of them allowed themselves to feel it fully. Victory. Not just survival or resistance. But absolute victory. And that too against a god. 1 down, 6 more fuckers to go. Very said, before opening a portal back to the third dimension. FSSHHH. As together, still chuckling under their breath, the two of them stepped through, leaving behind the corpse of a god, and a secret that would shake the universe when it was finally revealed. Planet Satoru, a few days later, Leo's POV. Just as expected, for the next few days, nobody noticed Yukiro's absence, as no immediate divine probe arrived to investigate what had happened to the Yu clan god after the battle on Satoru. Following the fight, Leo instructed Ver to remain completely out of the public eye for a while, because neither he nor Yukiro had officially been seen again after entering the fourth dimension, leaving the status of both uncertain to outsiders. So far, none of the enemy gods had looked too deeply into the matter, and yet Leo understood that as more time passed, suspicion surrounding Yukiro's disappearance would inevitably continue to grow. Once that happened, the scrutiny directed toward the cult would increase significantly, as sooner or later the great clans would realize that something beyond the normal outcome of a battlefield clash had taken place. However, while they might suspect that something had gone wrong, they could never truly prove it, because until the existence of Leo's origin blade became known, nobody would naturally assume that the cult possessed the means to kill a god. To the wider universe, even if the battle had somehow gone disastrously for Yukiro, the most logical conclusion would still be that he had become lost somewhere within the fourth-dimensional void, trapped beyond detection rather than confirmed dead. And that uncertainty played perfectly into Leo's hands, because for now, he had absolutely no intention of revealing either the true extent of his strength or the method by which he had ended the life of a god. Knock, knock. A soft knock sounded against the door, as Leo turned toward it and said, "Come in," while pulling his attention away from the projections before him. Shadow number 1 entered shortly after, his posture respectful but his expression carrying a visible hint of excitement that immediately made Leo raise an eyebrow. "My lord, there has been a development, and I come bearing good news," Shadow number 1 said, as he bowed slightly before stepping forward. "What is it?" Leo asked, as his gaze sharpened with curiosity while he waited for the report. "Planet Drexel has been successfully captured by the cult from the hands of the Rue clan," Shadow number 1 said, as a smile spread across his face while he delivered the news. "The campaign was an overwhelming success. Our losses remained relatively low, and according to the reports, your son Myron played a crucial role in securing victory," he continued, as Leo's expression shifted slightly. Shadow number 1's smile widened further as he added, "He single-handedly killed the enemy commander stationed on the planet, and many soldiers are already calling him the next cult master after witnessing his performance." Leo blinked once at that, as the pride that should have naturally surfaced was immediately buried beneath something closer to concern. "Wait," Leo said slowly, as he leaned forward slightly while his brows furrowed. "What about Commander Mickey James? What the hell was he doing if my son was the one fighting the enemy commander?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with disbelief. At that question, Shadow number 1's expression turned slightly awkward, as though he had anticipated that response but still had no clean way to frame the answer. "Well, my lord, it seems your son kind of jumped into the battle between Commander James and the enemy commander," Shadow number 1 said carefully, choosing every word with caution. "Once he declared himself as Myron Skyshard, the enemy commander shifted attention toward him, and although Commander James was close enough to intervene if necessary, your son defeated the target before that became necessary," he explained, as Leo closed his eyes for a moment and let out a long breath, as the image of Myron throwing himself into a commander-level fight with a grin on his face formed far too easily in his mind. "What am I supposed to do with that boy?" Leo muttered, as he opened his eyes again while shaking his head in weary disbelief. "He thinks war is some sort of arena game, where he can jump into whatever fight looks interesting and prove himself without thinking about the consequences," he continued, as irritation mixed with reluctant concern in his voice. "When will he understand that he needs to pick fights within his own weight class?" Leo added, as though genuinely annoyed by the recklessness. However, Shadow number 1's expression twitched slightly at those words, as for one dangerous moment he almost coughed out loud before forcing himself to remain perfectly composed. After all, listening to Leo talk about picking fights within his own weight class was almost ironic, as not even a few days ago, he himself had picked a fight with a god, who was by every means way above his weight class. And still, he now had the audacity to criticize his son for challenging above his station. To Shadow number 1, the similarities between father and son were almost painfully obvious, and yet out of respect for Leo, he wisely swallowed every thought that crossed his mind. "Indeed, my lord," Shadow number 1 said, as he lowered his head slightly while doing his absolute best not to smile too hard. Leo noticed the restraint in his expression and narrowed his eyes faintly, as though sensing that his subordinate was thinking something deeply disrespectful but choosing not to say it. "What?" Leo asked flatly. "Nothing, my lord," Shadow number 1 replied immediately, as his face became perfectly serious in a way that only made him look more suspicious. Leo stared at him for a moment longer before clicking his tongue, as he leaned back again while muttering under his breath about reckless sons, reckless commanders, and the unfortunate habit of children inheriting the worst traits of their fathers. "He should learn something from Caleb, that boy never makes me lose sleep. How did the second one come out so different from the first?" he muttered aloud. And yet, despite his outward protests, secretly, he was extremely proud of his boy. Meanwhile, planet Granada, Morris's paw. Kaboom! Thunder rolled endlessly across the dark skies of Granada, as violent streaks of lightning illuminated the endless storm clouds overhead while Morris stood alone upon the lone rock overlooking the raging sea below. The winds around him twisted unnaturally, his long hair rising upward toward the sky defying gravity, while within his hands rested a report that had clearly captured his complete attention. "Oh," Morris muttered softly, as his black eyes narrowed with amusement while he reread the contents of the report once more. "So the U-clan patriarch dies during the battle against the cult, and shortly after that, Yukiro personally goes to planet Satoru to avenge his descendant," he said, as the corners of his lips slowly curled upward. And now even Yukiro himself has disappeared, Morris continued, his voice lowering into something far more intrigued as another bolt of lightning illuminated the sadistic grin spreading across his face. Kaboom! The Yu-clan elders entered his palace to discuss the nomination of the next patriarch, yet nobody has managed to contact him for days, while the final known reports place him chasing a mysterious demigod named General Sparrow into a fourth-dimensional void, he read aloud, as his smile widened further. And ever since then, neither Yukiro nor General Sparrow have been seen again, while the cult continues expanding normally as though nothing unusual has happened at all, he finished, before lowering the report slowly. For a brief moment, silence followed. Then, ha 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 ha. Morris burst into manic laughter, his voice echoing violently across the storm-covered ocean while the skies above Granada roared in response to his amusement. Oh, I knew it. Morris muttered between chuckles, as excitement flickered behind his eyes while he looked toward the distant horizon. I knew investing in you would eventually pay dividends, Leo Skyshard, but I never expected the return to arrive this soon, he continued, as the grin on his face deepened into something bordering obsession. Although no report directly placed Leo at the scene, Morris already felt almost certain that the disappearance of Yukiro had something to do with him. The timing was too convenient. The circumstances too strange, and the cult's behavior afterward far too controlled for any of this to be a coincidence. Morris hummed thoughtfully, as he tapped the edge of the report lightly against his palm while countless theories began forming within his mind. But how did you do it? He muttered next, genuine curiosity slipping into his tone for the first time. Did Multheric help you? Did that old dragon finally decide to interfere directly and hand you an origin weapon? Morris wondered aloud, as lightning crackled around him. Or perhaps Soren left behind more blades than what he brought to the pit, he continued, his smile twitching slightly. What exactly is your trump card, Leo Skyshard? Morris asked softly, as his gaze darkened while his thoughts spiraled deeper. Or maybe, he added after a pause, his voice lowering further. Maybe Yukiro truly is just lost somewhere within the folds of the fourth dimension. Yet even as he voiced that possibility, Morris himself clearly did not believe it. No. His instincts leaned overwhelmingly toward Leo. And Morris trusted his instincts more than almost anything else in existence. Well, Morris muttered, as he slowly turned his gaze toward the endless storm above Granada. Now comes the interesting part. A cruel smile spread across his face once more. Because sooner or later, the vultures will realize that Yukiro is not coming back, he said, as amusement danced within his eyes. And once that realization settles in, the Yu clan will collapse into chaos far worse than the Su clan ever did. The thunder above intensified violently. At least the Su clan still had Su Tang protecting their foundation, Morris continued, as his tone carried mocking sympathy. But the Yu clan, he said with a quiet chuckle. They have nothing left holding them together anymore. Lightning illuminated his face once more. The great clan alliance has now lost another pillar, Morris whispered, almost reverently. And now we get to witness their true nature. Ha ha. His laughter returned again, softer this time. They will devour the remains of the Yu clan like starving vultures fighting over a corpse. Morris's eyes narrowed thoughtfully after saying that, as one final detail within the report continued bothering him slightly. What interests me most, he muttered slowly, is that the cult has not moved to aggressively capture Yu clan territory despite this opportunity. That detail mattered a lot. Because if the cult truly wanted to capitalize immediately, they should have been swallowing Yu clan planets one after another while the clan remained leaderless and vulnerable. Yet they were not. Instead, they were continuing their expansion against unrelated territories. Which was what made Morris feel the most suspicious, as it was almost as if they were deliberately trying to not look involved. As if they became the first party to start picking on the Yu clan, the others would suspect that they had confirmation about Yukiro's death. And that alone told Morris exactly how Leo was approaching this situation. Ha! Morris chuckled softly, as admiration flickered across his face. So that's your play. You do not want the universe realizing Yukiro is dead yet, because the moment they confirm that a god has fallen, the war stops being political. And starts becoming existential. His grin widened once more. Well played, Leo Skyshard. Well played. For a few seconds, Morris simply stood there listening to the storm. Then slowly, his expression became more serious. Unfortunately for you, he muttered quietly. I am not sure you fully understand the scale of what you have set into motion now. The winds around Granada intensified violently. Because from this point onward, there is no turning back anymore. His eyes gleamed sharply beneath the lightning. The balance of universal power is about to tilt one way or another at terrifying speed. And whether you want it or not, war is now coming to your doorstep. Planet Drexel, Myron's POV. After gaining his first true experience of war, Myron realized that he enjoyed it far more than he originally expected, as the thrill of battle lingered within him long after the fighting had already ended. The sensation refused to leave his mind. The rush of charging into danger. The pressure of life and death. The satisfaction of overcoming an enemy stronger than expected. All of it replayed endlessly within his thoughts, as though his body itself had already begun craving the battlefield again despite only recently stepping onto one for the first time. Man, I can't wait for the next war to begin already, Myron muttered, as he leaned back lazily in his chair while staring toward the ceiling of his temporary quarters. I wonder when Father will let us fight another campaign, he continued, before letting out a disappointed sigh while tapping his fingers restlessly against the armrest. Probably not for a few months at least, he grumbled. So what the hell am I even supposed to do until then? Knock knock. A sharp knock suddenly interrupted his thoughts, as Myron straightened slightly before speaking toward the door. Come in. The door opened shortly after, as one of the captains serving under his command stepped inside with a pale expression and visible injuries across his forehead and jaw. The moment Myron saw the condition he was in, his relaxed demeanor vanished instantly. What happened? Myron asked, his brows furrowing sharply while his tone turned cold. The captain lowered his gaze slightly before beginning his report. Lieutenant, while patrolling the Eastern District today, my unit was ambushed by local residents, the captain explained, as restrained anger flickered within his voice. They pelted our vehicles with stones first before deploying barricades across both ends of the street, trapping us between multiple apartment complexes, he continued, while Myron's expression darkened further with every word. Once we were boxed in, they attacked from all sides simultaneously using acid vials, Molotov cocktails, and improvised explosives thrown from elevated positions. The captain clenched his fists tightly. Thankfully, my men managed to fight our way out before the situation completely collapsed, however 14 soldiers suffered severe injuries during the retreat. His voice lowered slightly afterward. And one of my men was killed. Silence followed those words. A dangerous silence. However, the captain added carefully, we managed to eliminate some attackers during our escape before the rest scattered once they realized the blockade had failed. But unfortunately they scattered straight into other residential blocks, and so far none of the locals seemed keen on handing them over. I tried to sniff them out. However, with the whole Drexel population covering for them as though they're local heroes, it's hard to know exactly where they fled. So as of now, I'm afraid we have no reliable method of identifying exactly where they fled. The atmosphere inside the room shifted completely after that explanation. Clench. Myron's fists tightened violently, as fury surged across his face while killing intent leaked from his body without restraint. Fucking righteous faction cowards. Myron snarled. They attack from hiding, throw explosives from rooftops, kill one of my men, and then run like rats the moment real fighters push back. He stood abruptly from his chair. Take me there immediately, Myron ordered, his voice carrying violent intent. I'll slaughter every single one of them myself if I have to. The captain's eyes widened slightly at that response. Lieutenant, that is the problem, he explained cautiously. The attackers are no longer occupying the same residential blocks where the ambush happened, and after dispersing into the city, they became almost impossible to isolate individually. Even if I take you there, you will find nothing but broken windows and ransacked apartment buildings. The culprits are already gone. He hesitated briefly before continuing. If we pursue them aggressively now, we would have to search through massive civilian populations district by district. And with how much they seem to be covering for them, it seems like gaining any useful information will be impossible unless we torture it out of them. Myron gritted his teeth harder listening to that explanation. So what? He snapped immediately. You want me to sit quietly after one of my men got butchered? His breathing grew heavier. Those bastards wanted to rebel, didn't they? They wanted a fight. Fine, I'll give them a fight. The captain remained silent after hearing that, as he clearly understood that Myron's anger had already crossed the point where logic alone would calm him down. Regardless, he tried to stop him from making a reckless decision. Lieutenant, please escalate this to the commander. Just like you, I don't mind going to war with these rebels. However, I don't want to risk being court-martialed for it. The captain requested, as Myron let out a deep sigh. Sigh. All right, Myron muttered at last, forcing himself to steady his breathing slightly. I'll speak with Commander Mickey James first. His eyes narrowed dangerously afterward. And if he understands our anger and approves the offensive, good. But if he refuses, Myron said, his voice lowering into something far colder. Then I genuinely do not care anymore. I'll go punish the rebels alone. To hell with being court-martialed. A dangerous smile spread slowly across his face. If one of my soldiers died here, then I'll burn this entire damn city down if that's what it takes to avenge him." With that, Myron stormed out of the room immediately, his cloak whipping violently behind him as he headed straight toward Commander Mickey James's command center. Behind him, the injured captain watched Myron leave with a conflicted expression, as although the lieutenant's rage terrified him slightly, a part of him also understood it completely. Because after witnessing one of their own die burned alive inside a patrol vehicle, even he no longer wanted to treat the locals as respectable citizens. While somewhere deep within the endless cityscape of Drexel, hidden behind apartment walls and cheering civilians, the rebels celebrating today's ambush had absolutely no idea that they had just provoked the one guy they shouldn't have. As when Myron came for his revenge, he wasn't just going to come for them individually, but the city as a whole. Planet Drexel, Commander Mickey James's office, Myron's POV. Myron stormed into Commander Mickey James's office with fury written clearly across his face, as the atmosphere around him already felt dangerously unstable before he even spoke a word. Despite being buried beneath stacks of reports and ongoing military logistics, Commander James was forced to stop everything immediately once Myron entered the room in that state. "What happened now?" Commander James asked, as he leaned forward slightly in his chair while observing the young lieutenant carefully. Myron wasted no time explaining. He narrated the same incident his captain had reported earlier, however the way he spoke about it made the situation sound far uglier and far more personal. With every sentence, his anger rose higher. The veins around his neck and forearms became increasingly visible, as fury seeped deeper into his tone while his fists clenched harder after every few words. By the time he finished explaining the ambush, even Commander James could feel the rage radiating off him like heat from a furnace. Sigh. Commander James exhaled softly afterward, sympathy flickering briefly across his expression before his gaze hardened with responsibility once more. "Lieutenant, my deepest condolences for your loss," Commander James said calmly, as his voice carried genuine sincerity despite the difficult conversation ahead. "I understand exactly where your anger is coming from, however what you are proposing is neither practical nor acceptable under cult military law." Myron's jaw tightened listening to that response. "You are authorized to investigate this matter thoroughly and identify the individuals directly responsible for orchestrating the ambush," Commander James continued, his tone remaining firm yet measured. "And once those culprits are identified with certainty, you may punish them however you deem appropriate within operational boundaries." His eyes narrowed slightly afterward. "However, I will not authorize widespread torture, forced interrogations, or collective punishment against civilians simply because you are angry." Myron's expression darkened further. "For those uninvolved in the attack, punishment would be unjustified," Commander James said, as his tone sharpened while he spoke with greater conviction. "Your father was extremely clear regarding the standards and morals we are expected to uphold as soldiers of the cult. Yes, rebellion cannot be tolerated. Yes, law and order must be maintained. But innocent civilians cannot suffer for the crimes committed by a handful of extremists." Commander James folded his hands together afterward. "We are soldiers, Lieutenant. We are not tyrants. We do not abuse power simply because we possess it." For a brief moment, silence settled across the office. Then, "Morals," Myron repeated slowly, as though the word itself irritated him. Commander James nodded immediately. "Yes, morals." Myron let out a cold laugh afterward. "Huh. Our morals should be simple then," Myron replied, his eyes growing colder with every passing second. "Reward allies. Punish enemies." His voice lowered further afterward. "You think those attackers escaped because innocent civilians had nothing to do with it?" Myron stepped forward slightly. "They are hiding somewhere inside this city right now, while relatives, neighbors, and sympathizers cover for them like heroes protecting freedom fighters." His breathing grew heavier. "My captain knocks on doors asking questions, and these people look at us with disgust written all over their faces. They spit near our boots. They curse us under their breath. They pray every night for the Rue clan to return with reinforcements and butcher us." Commander James remained silent while listening. "They are not our people, Commander," Myron continued, his frustration bled openly into his voice now. "We liberated this planet from the Rue clan, we are stabilizing their infrastructure and bringing new technology to their world that will improve their quality of life significantly. And still they hate us down to their bones." His fists tightened again. "I never went out of my way to make their lives miserable before today. But now one of my own men is dead. And I refuse to take that lying down." Myron's eyes locked directly onto Commander James afterward. "You either approve this operation, or I proceed without your approval." The room fell silent instantly after those words. "Because this is the kind of man I intend to become," Myron said, his tone steady despite the anger burning underneath it. "When my soldiers follow my orders and step onto dangerous streets under my command, they trust that if something goes wrong, their lieutenant will come for them. And if he cannot save them, then he will damn sure avenge them. Commander James stared at him quietly afterward before slowly rising from his seat, his expression turning significantly more serious than before. Grab. His hand lowered toward the weapon hanging beside his waist. Myron immediately noticed the motion, however instead of retreating, he straightened further and met the commander's gaze directly without fear. Just because you are the cult master's son does not mean I will allow you to run wild under my command, Commander James said firmly. You are still a lieutenant serving beneath me, and your actions reflect directly upon this military administration. His gaze sharpened afterward. So do not threaten me again by saying you will do whatever you please. I already told you that you may punish those responsible. But innocent civilians remain off limits. Commander James's tone hardened fully afterward. Follow my directive, or face disciplinary punishment. This is not a negotiation. Myron remained silent for several seconds after hearing that response. 9:57. Then slowly, I have nothing but respect for you, Commander, he replied calmly, though the dangerous conviction behind his words only deepened. But this is where you are mistaken. His eyes never wavered. I am going to do this my way. Not because I simply want to, but because I genuinely believe I must. The atmosphere inside the office became increasingly tense afterward. My sense of justice is absolute in this regard, Commander, Myron continued, his voice steady despite the fury still boiling beneath it. And the promises I make to my men are promises I fully intend to keep no matter the consequences. He stepped forward one final time. So I will find those culprits my way, whether you approve of it or not. His gaze sharpened dangerously afterward. And if you intend to stop me, then we should probably settle this on the training grounds right now. Commander James's eyes narrowed instantly. I am not afraid of you, Commander, Myron finished, his voice calm enough to become genuinely unsettling. But if you stand between me and my justice, then yes, I will fight you too, Myron announced, as the tension within the room reached its peak at that declaration. Planet Satoru, Leo's POV. After Planet Satoru had been fully stabilized following Yukiro's disappearance, Leo finally brought his family out from the time-stilled world and relocated them onto the planet. He made that decision carefully, because although only a few weeks had passed for him outside, nearly 4 entire years had passed for his family within the sealed dimension. The disparity was becoming too extreme. Every single day Leo spent in the outside universe translated into nearly 100 days within the time-stilled world, which meant prolonged separation would only worsen over time. It was why he no longer wished to delay their reunion any further, as upon his orders they were brought onto Satoru at once. For the first time in a long while, the Skyshard family was finally together again beneath the same roof, as the atmosphere inside the residence remained unusually warm and peaceful. Amanda especially seemed happier than she had been in recent memory, as watching her smile again after everything they had endured together made even Leo feel a sense of calm that battlefield victories could never truly provide. However, unfortunately for him, that peace did not last very long. Knock knock. A soft knock echoed through the residence doors, as Leo slowly turned his gaze away from Amanda before letting out a faint sigh beneath his breath. Come in, Leo said calmly, though the interruption already irritated him slightly. Shadow number 1 entered shortly afterward, his posture respectful yet serious enough for Leo to immediately understand that this was not a casual visit. What is it? Leo asked, his tone noticeably colder now. I hope you understand that I was in the middle of reuniting with my wife, and I don't want to be bothered today. Shadow number 1 lowered his head slightly. There are 2 developments, my lord, both requiring your immediate attention, he replied carefully. The first is actually good news. Leo raised an eyebrow slightly afterward. It seems Lord Dumpy has finally stabilized his body following the complications caused by his demigod breakthrough nearly 2 years ago. Shadow number 1 continued speaking. He has successfully learned to control the corrosive aura leaking from his body and is now capable of safely traveling outside the sealed world again. A faint smile almost appeared on Leo's face hearing that report. Lord Dumpy is requesting permission to exit the time-stilled world and travel personally to planet Satoru so he may fight beneath your banner once more. Leo nodded casually afterward before waving his hand dismissively, as though the matter itself did not require much discussion despite the relief he secretly felt internally. Approved, Leo replied simply. What's the second issue? The moment he asked that question, Shadow number 1's expression visibly stiffened slightly, immediately making Leo's instinct sharpen. My lord, Shadow number 1 began carefully. Commander Mickey James contacted us personally earlier today regarding a serious incident involving your second-born son. Leo closed his eyes briefly afterward. What did Myron do this time? He asked flatly, already sounding exhausted before hearing the actual explanation. Shadow number 1 inhaled deeply before continuing. One of the soldiers under Myron's command was killed during an ambush carried out by local civilians on planet Drexel. Following the incident, your son became increasingly aggressive and demanded permission to retaliate against the entire district involved. His voice lowered slightly afterward. Commander James refused those demands, judging the proposed retaliation to be excessive and morally unacceptable under cult military law. Leo's expression darkened gradually. However, Myron refused to comply with the commander's orders, Shadow number 1 continued carefully. In the end, the disagreement escalated into a direct confrontation between them. Leo's expression turned dark at those words, as he gritted his teeth and shook his head. He fought James? Leo asked slowly. Shadow number 1 nodded immediately. Yes, my lord. Although Commander James ultimately won the battle, reports state that your son fought extremely well and even managed to injure the commander several times during the exchange. The room grew noticeably quieter afterward. Following the duel, Myron was restrained and formally court-martialed for openly defying military command authority. Shadow number 1 lowered his head further afterward. Commander James has reportedly offered to let him go if only he writes a formal apology and gives up on his demand to burn down a district. However, Myron absolutely refuses to comply. As of this moment, your son is currently imprisoned under military custody awaiting formal judgment. Leo remained silent after hearing the full report, his expression hardening, as he alternated his gaze between Shadow number 1 and Amanda. Because although Myron's actions deeply disturbed him, hearing that his own son was now sitting chained inside a military prison still caused something inside his chest to tighten painfully. That fool, Leo muttered, as he clenched his fists tightly while shaking his head in visible frustration after hearing the full extent of Myron's actions. There are far better ways to accomplish what he wants without openly challenging the chain of command like some reckless barbarian. His jaw tightened afterward. But of course, following orders was never really an option for that boy once his emotions got involved. Shadow number 1 remained silent briefly before speaking again, his expression growing even more serious than before. That is not the only issue, my lord, he said carefully. Leo immediately looked toward him again. What now? He asked, already sounding tired. Shadow number 1 inhaled deeply before continuing. Apparently, the moment Myron was arrested and placed into military custody, the entirety of his assigned unit demanded to be imprisoned alongside him. Leo blinked once hearing that. They what? He asked slowly. They insisted that if their lieutenant was being punished, then they should be punished alongside him as well, because they had willingly followed him knowing exactly what he intended to do. Shadow number 1 explained calmly. And when Commander James refused those demands, several soldiers openly threatened to break into the prison facility and forcefully free Myron themselves. For a brief moment, Leo simply stared at him in silence. Before then slowly raising both hands toward the ceiling in complete disbelief. Oh, for fuck's sake, Leo muttered beneath his breath, sounding more exhausted than angry now. Your son has inspired an unusually extreme level of loyalty among his men, Shadow number 1 continued afterward. The soldiers following him are not simply respecting his authority as their superior officer anymore. They are genuinely willing to die for him. His eyes lowered slightly afterward. And while that level of loyalty is admirable in many ways, it is also becoming increasingly dangerous to the structure Commander James is trying to maintain. Leo's expression darkened gradually listening to that explanation. It does not take much for sparks like this to spread through military ranks, my lord, Shadow number 1 warned quietly. Especially during wartime, where charismatic figures capable of inspiring absolute loyalty can rapidly gather support from dissatisfied soldiers. The room fell silent afterward. If Myron is not properly contained now, Shadow number 1 continued carefully, choosing every word with caution. Then eventually, there may emerge an extremist faction within the cult whose loyalty aligns more closely with his personal ideology than with wider cult doctrine itself. Leo's eyes narrowed sharply at that statement. Because although Shadow number 1 never said it directly, the implication behind those words was perfectly clear. Either Leo suppressed Myron now before this spark evolved into something larger. Or he allowed him to continue growing naturally, eventually forming his own distinct wing within the cult, made up of men willing to carry out actions the wider organization would never officially endorse. And honestly, knowing Myron's personality, Leo could already picture exactly which path his son was unconsciously heading toward. Planet Drexel, Leo's POV. The moment Leo's craft descended onto Planet Drexel and entered the military hangar zone, he immediately sensed that the atmosphere below was far too tense. Commander Mickey James stood outside personally waiting to receive him, while tens of thousands of soldiers crowded the surrounding Bay Area despite strict security restrictions already being in place. It almost looked less like a military reception and more like an army waiting for judgment from its ruler after committing some unforgivable crime. The first thing Leo noticed after stepping out of the craft was the state Commander James was currently in. Bandages wrapped around his forearms, his shoulder, part of his neck, even one side of his ribs appeared restrained beneath reinforced combat wrappings, clearly indicating that the earlier reports regarding Myron's resistance had not been exaggerated. And immediately, Leo could already picture how the fight must have unfolded. Commander James likely restrained himself throughout most of the battle, trying to subdue Myron without inflicting serious damage upon the cult master's son. Meanwhile, Myron would have shown no such hesitation whatsoever. To him, it would have been a real fight. A clash between conviction and opposition. Which was why, in Leo's eyes, the entire situation resembled less of a duel and more of a responsible adult struggling against an enraged spoiled child. Still, despite noticing the injuries immediately, Leo did not comment on them at all. "Commander," Leo acknowledged simply, as he gave Mickey James a small nod while continuing to walk forward without slowing his pace whatsoever. Commander James bowed his head respectfully. "My lord," he muttered. However, before anything else could be said, the surrounding soldiers suddenly erupted into noise from every direction simultaneously. "It's not Lieutenant Myron's fault, Cult Master. Please free the lieutenant. He only stood up for us. The lieutenant did nothing wrong. He was protecting the honor of our fallen brothers." The voices echoed endlessly across the hangar area, as more and more soldiers started shouting over one another while emotions rapidly spiraled out of control. Leo stopped walking. Then slowly, he turned his head slightly toward the crowd. FWOOSH. A suffocating wave of aura spread outward from his body instantly, crushing across the hangar bay like invisible gravity while the air itself became difficult to breathe under the pressure. As immediately, silence gripped the Bay Area as a whole. "Need I remind all of you?" Leo said coldly, his voice carrying across the entire hangar despite not being raised even slightly. "That every single soldier standing here has sworn loyalty to Commander James first and foremost while serving beneath his command." His eyes swept slowly across the gathered troops afterward. "He is standing right beside me. And yet all of you openly challenge his authority without shame." The pressure in the atmosphere deepened further. "I do not remember raising the cult army to become this undisciplined." Nobody dared respond. "Or perhaps," Leo continued quietly, "I should suspend this entire legion and replace every commanding officer stationed on Drexel altogether." Several soldiers visibly paled hearing that possibility. Leo clicked his tongue afterward before continuing forward again without sparing another glance toward the crowd surrounding him. Meanwhile behind him, nobody dared speak anymore. The military prison beneath Drexel's central command facility was unnaturally quiet by comparison, as only the sounds of boots striking steel corridors echoed through the underground halls. Step, step, step. As Leo walked deeper into the prison alongside Commander James, more and more imprisoned soldiers slowly stood upright within their cells after noticing his arrival. Then one after another, they saluted. "Cult Master! Cult Master! Cult Master!" The voices gradually spread throughout the prison block as every imprisoned soldier straightened themselves proudly despite their current conditions. And yet, Leo acknowledged none of them. Not a single one. His gaze remained fixed forward the entire time while he continued walking deeper into the prison until finally reaching the final reinforced containment chamber. The cell where Myron was currently being held. Slam. Leo kicked the prison door open violently before stepping inside without hesitation, as the heavy reinforced steel gate slammed against the surrounding walls from sheer force. Inside the chamber, Myron was suspended in the air by 4 massive steel chains attached tightly around his limbs and torso, forcing his body into a restrained spread position without allowing meaningful movement whatsoever. The moment Leo entered, however, Myron raised his chin slightly, then smiled. "Old man," Myron greeted casually, as though he were not currently chained inside a military prison after assaulting one of the cult's highest-ranking commanders. "Sorry for interrupting your usually busy schedule. I know it must have been an inconvenience for you to travel all the way here." His smile widened slightly afterward. "If I was just a bit stronger, I probably could have resolved this situation myself already. But rest assured, that mistake will never be repeated," he said, as, clench. Leo's fists tightened instantly hearing those words, as it took genuine restraint from him to not walk forward and smack the stupidity straight out of his son's face. "You," Leo muttered slowly, "do you even realize where you went wrong here, Myron?" he questioned, as he secretly hoped that having spent a few hours in captivity had given Myron a chance to repent. However, unfortunately, it did not seem like it, as Myron simply lowered his gaze at the question. My only mistake was not being strong enough, father, he answered calmly. That is genuinely the only mistake I made here. Leo's expression darkened immediately. If there is anything else I regret. Myron continued afterward. It is the injuries I caused Commander James during our fight. His eyes shifted briefly toward the commander standing outside the cell. Believe me, those injuries were never intentional. But once the fight escalated beyond a certain point, holding back stopped becoming possible. Leo stared at him in disbelief afterward before shaking his head slowly. No, no, no. You learned absolutely nothing from this entire ordeal. His voice sharpened further. Fighting is not the solution to every single problem you encounter. Being strong means absolutely nothing if you lack the brains necessary to use that strength responsibly. Myron listened quietly before eventually letting out a deep sigh. I can act rationally when necessary, father. But this situation was never going to be one of those moments. His eyes slowly lifted afterward until they met Leo's directly. Let me ask you something honestly. He began, as the atmosphere inside the prison cell grew heavier immediately. Suppose it was me who died during that ambush instead of some random patrol soldier. Myron's gaze never wavered. What would your response have been then? Leo remained silent. What would Commander James have done? Would either of you truly respond with calm restraint and measured retaliation? Myron's voice lowered further afterward. Or would Drexel already be burning? The question struck harder than Leo expected. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. If Myron had died on this planet, Leo probably would not have cared who was responsible individually. The entire world itself would have paid the price. You see, Myron continued quietly after noticing Leo's silence. What you would have done, what Commander James might secretly want to do, and what I wanted to do, are not actually that different. Leo's eyes narrowed sharply. The only real difference between us is that your emotions extend only toward your own blood, while mine extend toward every single soldier serving beneath my command. The chains around Myron rattled slightly as he shifted position. My sense of justice is not wrong here, father. And if Commander James disagrees with it, that still does not automatically make him correct. For several long seconds, nobody inside the room spoke. I have no further reflection to make regarding this matter, Myron finished calmly. Other than acknowledging that I am still too weak. His eyes sharpened afterward, and that I need to become stronger soon. He declared, as Leo shook his head in disapproval, clearly unhappy with his son's mentality regarding this issue. The underground prison, Leo's POV. Myron's complete lack of remorse left Leo feeling deeply frustrated, because had his son shown even the slightest regret, this entire situation could still have been peacefully resolved. However, instead of doing that, Myron stood before him with unwavering conviction in his eyes, genuinely believing that everything he had done was justified from beginning to end. And that stubborn certainty was exactly what made the situation so exhausting for Leo to deal with. Ah, what a damn headache. Leo thought internally, as he rubbed lightly at his forehead while already feeling a migraine forming beneath the surface. Because before leaving planet Satoru, Amanda had only asked one thing of him. Set their son free. That was all she wanted. And although Leo knew she would understand if Myron remained imprisoned after openly defying military command authority, a part of her would still suffer silently as a mother. She would not sleep peacefully knowing her son remained chained inside a prison cell somewhere far away from home. And because of that, Leo found himself hesitating. He hesitated, not because he did not know what the correct decision was here, but because emotions complicated this matter. Because, his wife being an innocent bystander in this situation made it feel even messier than usual. Exhale. Let me explain something to you properly, son, Leo said at last, his tone calmer now despite the irritation lingering beneath the surface. You keep asking what I would have done if you were the one who died during that ambush. His eyes narrowed slightly afterward. But that is not the reality we are currently dealing with, is it? Myron remained silent. You want vengeance for the soldier who died beneath your command. And honestly, I would probably want revenge too. Leo admitted openly. If one of my own commanders died because of an ambush like this, I would absolutely make sure the people responsible paid the price eventually. His gaze sharpened afterward. But the difference between us lies in how we approach the problem. Myron's expression shifted slightly listening to that. You immediately jumped toward mass retaliation because you lacked the patience and intelligence necessary to solve the actual issue standing before you. Leo continued firmly. If I handled this situation instead, I would quietly isolate the exact culprits responsible without terrorizing an entire district full of unrelated civilians. His voice lowered further afterward. That would have been the real problem worth solving. And that is exactly where your thinking failed. Leo slowly stepped closer afterward until he stood directly before Myron's restrained body. You are too one-dimensional right now. You see violence first, and solutions second. For several seconds, the prison cell remained silent. Then finally, Leo spoke again. 6 hours. Myron blinked once. I will solve this situation within 6 hours, and I will do it without harming a single innocent civilian. His eyes locked directly onto Myron's afterward. And once I succeed, how ashamed of yourself do you think you will feel? He asked, as for the first time since the conversation began, Myron looked uncertain. His brows furrowed slightly as though genuinely trying to determine whether what Leo described was even realistically possible. Until eventually, he lowered his gaze briefly before speaking again. If you can actually accomplish that, Father, then I will admit that I was wrong here. Leo remained silent while listening. I will apologize properly to Commander James. And to my unit as well. Myron exhaled softly afterward. If there truly exists a solution to this situation where the real culprits are punished while the bystanders are not heckled, then naturally I would prefer that outcome too. His eyes lifted again afterward. But I only chose my path because I genuinely could not see another one available. Leo nodded slowly hearing that. And finally, some of the anger inside him eased slightly. It is fine to punish those who genuinely wronged you. It is fine to retaliate against rebels and enemy sympathizers. Leo continued calmly. But once you stop distinguishing between guilty people and innocent civilians, you slowly stop valuing human life itself. His gaze darkened afterward. And that is how monsters are created. The chains around Myron rattled softly as he shifted slightly in place while listening carefully now. Most common people do not care about universal politics nearly as much as you think they do, Leo continued. They simply want stable lives, food on their tables, security for their families, and the freedom to live peacefully. His eyes drifted briefly toward the prison walls afterward. But the moment you personally give them a reason to hate you, they will eventually unite against you. Leo's tone grew heavier afterward. You might get away with cruelty for a century. Maybe 2. Maybe even several millennia. But eventually, retribution always arrives. A faint bitterness surfaced in his eyes afterward. The cult itself is proof of that reality. If the righteous faction had treated cult citizens like actual human beings instead of disposable filth, perhaps we would not hate them the way we do today. The atmosphere inside the prison grew quieter afterward. But because we suffered first, we understand exactly what kind of treatment should never be inflicted upon others. Leo looked directly into Myron's eyes afterward. You are still young. Far too young. You do not need to form such absolute opinions about every issue surrounding the universe already. His voice softened slightly afterward. You have spent almost your entire life isolated within the time-stilled world surrounded by soldiers, war stories, and hatred toward the righteous faction. And because of that your worldview has become distorted without you even realizing it. Myron's expression stiffened slightly hearing that. You were taught that the cult is righteous. That the enemy is evil. That violence solves problems. But reality is never that simple. Leo shook his head slowly afterward. There is always gray between extremes. There are always middle paths between blind submission and overwhelming violence. And if you truly want to become a worthy leader someday, then you need to start finding those paths yourself. The room fell silent once more afterward. Today alone, Leo continued quietly. Your actions forced me to abandon important responsibilities on planet Satoru. They interrupted my reunion with your mother. And right now, your mother cannot even sleep peacefully knowing her son remains chained inside a prison. Myron's expression shifted slightly again. You may think your life affects only yourself, but that is not true. Myself, your mother, Caleb, your uncle, your aunt, we all care about you deeply. Leo's gaze hardened afterward. And if tomorrow the righteous faction captured you, all hell would break loose across the universe. Because I would not be the only person marching to save you. The prison air felt heavier afterward. So before you act, you must start understanding the wider consequences behind your decisions. Your actions ripple far beyond yourself, affecting your soldiers, the chain of command, and even the stability of entire planets. Leo gestured toward the prison outside afterward. If you openly defy Commander James before your subordinates, then what example does that set for the rest of the military? If a lieutenant can ignore his commander, why should captains obey their lieutenants? Why should ordinary soldiers obey anyone at all? Myron remained completely silent now. The universe is far more complicated than you currently understand. And right now, you are still far too naive to properly grasp those complexities. Leo finished quietly before finally turning around toward the prison exit, as his expression remained stern despite the exhaustion visible beneath it. Then without another word, he gestured for Commander James to follow him outside, as he exited Myron's cell. Planet Drexel, Commander James's office, Myron's POV. After leaving the underground prison earlier that day, Leo immediately headed toward the district where the ambush against Myron's patrol unit had originally taken place. From there, the situation unraveled frighteningly quickly. Using his aura perception and ability to discern truth from lies, Leo interrogated civilians one after another while calmly filtering through thousands of conflicting statements with terrifying efficiency. Some people lied, some stayed silent, some genuinely knew nothing. Yet eventually, small inconsistencies began revealing themselves naturally beneath Leo's questioning, as fear and greed slowly started breaking apart the solidarity protecting the perpetrators. And once money entered the equation, things became even easier. Leo offered sums so absurdly large that even lifelong loyalty began crumbling under temptation, as commoners quietly started exposing hidden details regarding suspicious neighbors and disappearing family members. One person led to another. Another led to 3 more. And within barely 2 hours, Leo already possessed a rough understanding of who had orchestrated the ambush and where they were likely hiding afterward. After that point, the rest became simple. Because with Leo's perception abilities capable of sensing life signatures through walls and detecting emotional fluctuations from entire buildings away, hiding from him became almost impossible. Doors were kicked open, safe houses were uncovered, hidden tunnels were discovered, and one by one, every single perpetrator involved in the attack was dragged out into the open without a single innocent civilian being harmed in the process. As exactly 6 hours later, clang, Myron's prison chains were finally released before several guards escorted him directly toward Commander James's office beneath heavy supervision. At first, Myron expected another interrogation. Another lecture perhaps. However, the moment he entered the office chambers, his expression shifted completely. Because lined across the floor before him, kneeling with trembling bodies and horror-filled expressions, were every single perpetrator responsible for the ambush. Sob, sob. Some cried quietly. Some stared at Leo like they were looking at a monster. Others could not even lift their heads anymore. And standing above them all, was Leo. His expression cold, his gaze lazy, as he looked down on Myron with disappointed eyes. "This," Leo said slowly, as he pointed towards the criminals. "This is what I expect from you as my son." The room remained deathly quiet afterward. "This is where I want you to use your head in the future," Leo continued, his tone calm yet carrying immense pressure behind every word spoken. "These are the kinds of situations a leader must learn how to resolve properly." His eyes narrowed slightly afterward. Anyone can become a tyrant. But not everyone can become a responsible ruler. Myron remained completely silent while listening now. "And if you cannot solve problems like this yourself," Leo continued quietly, "then surround yourself with people capable of doing it for you." A faint trace of nostalgia surfaced in Leo's eyes afterward. "For me, that person was Chaosbringer." Myron looked up slightly hearing that name. He possessed no special strength. He wasn't even a master-tier fighter. He had no special bloodline flowing through his veins. Leo exhaled softly afterward. "And yet despite all that, he still possessed more wisdom than most powerful men I have met throughout my life." His gaze drifted briefly toward the kneeling prisoners afterward. "I learned many things from him. Things strength alone could never teach." Leo looked back toward Myron again afterward. "You need to find your own path through this universe someday. And perhaps more importantly, you need to find your own Chaosbringer." The atmosphere inside the office turned heavier after that. However, Leo continued, his voice growing colder again. "If today's incident taught me anything, it is that you are fundamentally unfit for military command under the cult's current structure." Myron's eyes widened slightly afterward. "For openly defying Commander James. For attacking a superior officer. And for refusing lawful military authority." Leo's expression hardened completely. "I hereby dismiss you from your rank as lieutenant within the cult army effective immediately." Silence followed those words. Heavy silence. "If you wish to gather followers independently someday and form your own faction," Leo continued calmly, "then do it outside the formal military chain of command." His eyes sharpened afterward. "Because as of today, you no longer possess the discipline required to serve beneath another commander. I will not allow you to poison the disciplined environment that commanders like James have spent decades trying to build within the cult army," Leo declared, as he shook his head in anger. "You are not the sort of person who will suddenly become obedient after one punishment or one lecture." A faint sigh escaped him afterward. "And honestly, I do not even think forcing you into discipline would suit the kind of person you are becoming." Myron remained silent while listening carefully now. "So rather than keeping you shackled beneath a system you clearly reject," Leo continued calmly, "I am giving you freedom instead." The room grew quieter afterward. "You are a free bird, Myron. You may create your own unit and you may lead it however you see fit. His expression hardened slightly afterward. And if you truly wish to become a tyrant someday, then that choice will also belong entirely to you. The kneeling prisoners lowered their heads further hearing those words, while even Commander James's expression shifted slightly at the direction this conversation was taking. However, Leo added quietly, "If today's incident taught you anything at all, then I expect you to lead those men more responsibly than you handled this situation." His gaze drifted briefly toward the captured rebels kneeling across the room. The cult army cannot always operate in morally gray territories without consequences. But smaller independent units. Leo narrowed his eyes slightly. They can go where formal militaries cannot. The implication behind those words slowly settled into the room. If the cult someday requires individuals willing to carry out operations beyond the limits of conventional command structures, then I will call upon your unit. Myron's eyes sharpened slightly hearing that. And depending on how competently you perform, Leo continued, I may entrust you with planetary conquest, occupation management, or responsibilities even greater than those. His voice lowered afterward. Or perhaps I may entrust you with nothing at all. Because from this point onward, your future will depend entirely on your own merits. Leo stepped closer afterward until he stood directly before Myron once again. But regardless of what happens next, this was your final day serving beneath Commander James. Commander James silently exhaled hearing that declaration, though he did not interrupt. I cannot spend my entire life spoon-feeding you lessons every time your emotions spiral out of control, Leo continued quietly. I am your father, and that bond will never disappear. Not while either of us still exists. For a brief moment, the sternness in Leo's eyes softened slightly. I will always care about you. But I cannot always protect you from yourself. The atmosphere inside the office turned heavier afterward. The kind of man you ultimately become, you must decide that yourself. Leo's tone remained calm throughout, yet every word carried immense weight behind it now. But if you approach this universe with an open mind, if you learn to see what is truly right and truly wrong through your own experiences instead of blind hatred, then perhaps someday you will grow into someone worthy of leading others properly. Myron lowered his gaze slightly afterward, clearly absorbing the seriousness behind Leo's words now. Consider this your punishment, Leo declared finally. Because from today onward, I formally withdraw my direct support from you entirely. Myron's eyes widened slightly at that. No funding, no military backing, no special treatment because you are my son. His expression remained completely firm afterward. If you want soldiers, recruit them yourself. If you want transport ships, buy them yourself. If you want logistics, infrastructure, weapons, salaries, or operational support, you will build every piece of it from the ground up with your own hands. The pressure inside the room deepened further. You will lead those men into dangerous battles. You will carry responsibility for every life beneath your command. And you will either rise or collapse under the weight of your own decisions. For several long seconds afterward, nobody inside the office spoke. Then finally, Leo looked directly into Myron's eyes one last time. And only after you achieve something truly meaningful through your own efforts, will I finally let you integrate back into Cult's central command. Earning a title as a commander, or a general, he declared, as he rubbed Myron on the head once, before turning to leave, as he left the matter at that. 1 month later, Planet V Star, Leo's POV. A lot changed within the cult during the month following Myron's official dismissal from the military chain of command, as the aftermath of Leo's decision spread further than even he originally expected. Roughly 100,000 soldiers eventually chose to abandon formal service beneath the cult army and instead pledged themselves directly beneath Myron's banner despite the uncertainty surrounding his future. Which was surprising to Leo, since, at present, Myron possessed no established logistics network, no military funding, no fleet, and no reliable supply chain capable of supporting an independent fighting force properly. He was effectively stranded on planet Drexel, and was completely cut off from official cult military support, and yet despite all those disadvantages, men still continued gathering around him voluntarily. Some believed in his ideals. Others simply admired his conviction. And some followed him because they genuinely believed he would someday become a monster capable of reshaping the cult itself. However, despite the loss of manpower, removing Myron from the formal military structure ultimately stabilized Commander James's division far more effectively than Leo originally anticipated. The soldiers remaining beneath James understood clearly now that military discipline stood above personal connections, as even the cult master himself would not undermine the authority of his commanders for family. And because of that, faith in the military hierarchy strengthened significantly afterward. So that's the whole picture. Leo explained to the timeless assassin's projection, as the old man stroked his beard thoughtfully in response. I think you made the correct decision here, the timeless assassin's projection eventually said, as his ancient eyes reflected faint understanding rather than criticism. Children rarely grow properly when their entire path through life is decided for them by force. A bitter smile appeared briefly across his face afterward. I tried too hard to shape both Caliph and Soren into what I believed they should become. His gaze drifted toward the distant horizon. And looking back now, perhaps that was my greatest mistake as a father. Leo remained silent while listening carefully. So honestly, the old man continued quietly. I think allowing Myron to walk his own path while merely guiding him where possible is far healthier than trying to chain him beneath your own beliefs completely. He said, as the winds around V-Star howled outside their hut. And if that boy has already managed to attract followers toward his ideology, then that simply means his way of thinking is not isolated within the cult. If not for him leading it, there would eventually be someone else. Because, ideologies like these unite people whether you want them united or not. If enough people believe in what he's doing, then even if he dies or abandons the path, they will continue on it till the end. The projection shrugged slightly afterward. So there is not much you can realistically do about it for now. Leo let out a deep sigh hearing that response. Hearing those words from someone who had already experienced similar failures firsthand eased some of the uneasiness lingering within him, because quietly, a part of Leo genuinely feared history repeating itself once again, and him being betrayed by one of his sons. What about the fallout from Yukiro's disappearance? The timeless assassin's projection asked next, smoothly shifting the conversation elsewhere. How are you handling that situation currently? Leo exhaled a tired sigh at that question, before shaking his head slightly. I think I'm handling it well enough for now, he replied. But eventually the silence surrounding the Yu clan will become too suspicious to ignore. His eyes narrowed slightly afterward. At most, I think we have another month or two before the other gods begin reacting seriously toward Yukiro's continued absence. I think one or two of them will appear on planet U Prime unannounced, demanding to meet him. And once his absence is confirmed, they will start to devour the Yu clan. The projection nodded calmly. That outcome was inevitable from the beginning. He spoke without much concern. The Great Clan Alliance was never built upon genuine trust or brotherhood between its members. A faint chuckle escaped him afterward. It was merely an alliance formed from convenience and mutual fear. Lightning crackled faintly across distant clouds surrounding V-Star. So honestly, most of them probably care less about whether Yukiro is dead and more about who inherits his territories afterward. Leo nodded slightly hearing that assessment. Because that aligned perfectly with what he himself was expecting. The vultures have already started circling around the Yu clan, Leo explained quietly. Internal probes are increasing daily, and several small neighboring clans have already begun positioning themselves to absorb Yu clan resources once instability fully erupts. His expression hardened afterward. Although out of all of them, the Ru clan seems the most suspicious regarding Yukiro's disappearance. The projection raised an eyebrow slightly. They've already begun quietly investigating the battle on Satoru. He asked, as Leo nodded in response. Yes, they are searching aggressively for information now. The old man chuckled softly hearing that. Well, there was always a rumor that Yukiro might be in love with Ruvasa. But I never believed it. However, if the Ru clan is probing harder than others then, it might be a possibility that the rumors were true. 555. The projection's voice remained calm and confident, as Leo raised a surprised eyebrow at the unexpected gossip. Well, it doesn't matter anyways. The Ru clan won't come for the cult even if Ruvasa was Yukiro's lover. Because between the cult and the crippled Yu clan, the Yu clan currently appears weaker and more vulnerable. His eyes sharpened afterward. So before the great clans unite against you, they will first devour what remains of the Yu first. Leo remained silent hearing that. Because realistically, that exact outcome was what he had been gambling everything upon from the start. For several moments afterward, silence settled peacefully between the two. Until eventually, it was the timeless assassin's projection who spoke again. By the way, he muttered casually. Have you finally decided whether or not you intend to ascend into godhood? Leo looked toward him afterward before slowly shaking his head. Because unlike previous realms of cultivation, ascending from demigod into godhood was actually fairly straightforward in theory. There were no complicated potions required. No hidden manuals. No mystical treasures. One simply needed to temper their body sufficiently before merging themselves with the stream of time itself to become a god, as the only difference between demigods and gods was the fact that a demigod still possessed mortal flesh existing separately from the flow of time, while a true god had already merged into it. And because of that integration, Gods possessed vastly superior durability, immortality, recovery, and divine essence output compared to ordinary demigods, which made mastering the laws of the universe the most complicated step in ascending to godhood, which Leo had already completed while becoming a demigod. Which meant that if he truly wanted to, he could ascend relatively quickly from this point onward. And yet, despite possessing the capability, Leo still hesitated deeply regarding taking that final step. I honestly don't know anymore, Leo admitted quietly after a long silence. Fighting Yukiro made me realize something important. His eyes drifted toward the runes lighting the timeless assassin's hut. With a little more body tempering, a deeper understanding of universal laws, and a few more perfected techniques, I can probably already fight multiple gods simultaneously without needing to ascend myself. The projection listened silently. So from a practical standpoint, I no longer feel like godhood is truly necessary for me to achieve supremacy. Leo's voice softened slightly afterward. But honestly, that is not even the real reason I hesitate. The winds around them slowed faintly. The truth is, I'm not sure if I actually want to live forever. The projection's expression shifted subtly hearing that. Perhaps decades ago the idea of becoming a god would have consumed me completely, Leo continued quietly. But the older I grow, the more I realize that my life only truly has meaning because of the people surrounding me. Amanda, Caleb, Myron, his family, the cult, all of it. Leo lowered his gaze afterward. I think a few hundred years would already be enough for me. Enough time to stabilize the cult, to leave behind a lasting legacy, to watch my children grow capable enough to inherit what I built. A faint smile appeared briefly across his face afterward. And after that, I think I would rather step away quietly. The projection remained completely silent now. Maybe live peacefully somewhere remote with Amanda. Leo continued softly. And if she passes away before me, then honestly, I don't even know if I would want to continue living afterward. The admission lingered heavily between them afterward. Sometimes I feel cowardly for thinking that way, Leo admitted. As though I'm simply afraid of walking through eternity alone. He shook his head slowly afterward. But at the same time, I genuinely do not know what I would even pursue anymore after becoming the strongest existence in the universe. For several long moments afterward, the timeless assassin's projection said nothing. Then eventually, the old man simply let out a long sigh. Because long ago, he himself had once asked those exact same questions. And because, he himself had hesitated for a few decades before finally making the final leap. Once he realized that the conquest for ultimate power never felt complete, while he was still a demigod. A few days later, planet Satoru, Leo's POV. Even after Leo approved Dumpy's transport outside the time-stilled world and toward planet Satoru, it still took the cult engineers nearly an entire decade of work to successfully devise a transport craft capable of surviving prolonged exposure to his corrosive presence, because ordinary metals dissolved within minutes around him while even reinforced alloys gradually softened and warped if left too close to his skin for extended periods. As although Dumpy learned how to control his corrosive aura, what he could not control was his naturally acidic skin and the heat it radiated naturally. Entire engineering teams had been reassigned exclusively toward the project, with countless prototype vessels failing one after another as the researchers slowly realized that the problem was no longer simply Dumpy's physical weight or size, but the fact that his very existence had become fundamentally incompatible with normal environments. Eventually, after years of experimentation, they abandoned conventional solutions entirely and instead recreated an artificial swamp ecosystem inside the transport vessel itself, constructing an enormous muddy containment chamber layered with ancient mire minerals, abyssal clay, corrosive-resistant monster membranes, and specially cultivated fungal matter capable of absorbing fragments of Dumpy's leaking aura before the surrounding structure could destabilize. As only after all that, only after 10 full years of obsessive refinement, did the cult finally succeed in transporting him safely to planet Satoru. As now, at long last, his vessel reached the new cult capital planet. FSHHH. A colossal black craft descended slowly through the cloudy skies of Satoru while dozens of stabilizing thrusters roared beneath it, their flames distorting beneath thick waves of muddy green vapor leaking from the transport chamber, as the surrounding landing zone had already been evacuated nearly 2 kilometers in every direction under direct military order. Nobody except Leo had been allowed to remain nearby. Even the transcendent guards stationed around the landing zone stood much farther back than usual, their expressions tense while faint warning alarms echoed from monitoring devices strapped around their wrists, because the environmental mana surrounding the craft had already begun fluctuating abnormally before the doors had even opened. Meanwhile, Leo stood alone near the landing zone itself with his arms folded behind his back, a faint smile resting across his face while he waited patiently for the transport chamber to open. It had been a long time since he had seen Dumpy properly, and hence, he was excited to meet his old friend, as despite everything that had changed throughout the years, a part of Leo still instinctively remembered the cute tiny frog that used to happily leap around behind him demanding food and attention. Which was why, despite all the warnings the engineers had given him beforehand, some small part of his mind still expected something vaguely familiar to emerge from the craft. Maybe larger, maybe stronger, but still, the same old Dumpy. However, the reality was something entirely different, as the moment the transport vessel landed. Boom! The entire landing platform trembled violently beneath its weight while pressure waves rippled outward across the surrounding planes, scattering dust and loose debris into the air as the thick containment doors at the front of the craft slowly began unlocking one after another. Clank asterisk clank asterisk clank. Massive locking mechanisms disengaged while corrosive vapor hissed through widening gaps between the doors, the air itself beginning to distort faintly as dark green mist rolled outward in heavy waves across the ground. And immediately, Leo's smile faded slightly, because something about the mist leaking from inside the vessel felt wrong to his instincts. As although there was nothing wrong about it on the surface, it was still oppressive to his senses, which was surprising because he had never felt this intimidated even in the presence of an actual god. Then, the first footstep landed. Thoom. Bubble. Sizzle. The reinforced titanium metal stairs of the ship blackened, sagged, and bubbled apart beneath the sheer corrosive pressure radiating from the creature stepping onto them, while thick clouds of acidic steam burst upward violently as entire sections of metal dissolved into bubbling sludge within seconds. The watching soldiers instinctively stepped backward. One transcendent subconsciously activated his mana barrier. Another's face visibly paled. Meanwhile Leo simply stared, because what emerged from the vessel no longer resembled the Dumpy he remembered, but rather a different beast entirely. The hell? Leo muttered, as the new Dumpy looked enormous. At a staggering 45 feet tall base form, he was now far larger than before, with his swollen body looking less like flesh and more like a living swamp condensed into physical form, as the once light green skin was now replaced by a deep muddy brown coloration that was covered in irregular black patches that pulsed faintly like infected stars beneath its surface. And wherever those black markings existed, reality itself seemed slightly unstable around them. The air warped faintly. Space shimmered unnaturally. Even ambient mana avoided those regions instinctively. Drop. Drop. Thick corrosive slime dripped constantly from Dumpy's massive body while the ground beneath him liquefied with every step, entire chunks of reinforced flooring dissolving into bubbling pits of black sludge before hardening again into dead stone. Plants nearby withered almost instantly, their structure simply collapsing, as though life itself gave up trying to exist near him. While even Leo, with his demigod durability, felt his skin begin to tingle. Then burn. As a faint hiss escaped from the fabric near his sleeves as microscopic corrosion began eating away at the outer layers of his clothing despite the natural mana reinforcement surrounding his body. And as though that alone was not enough to make his eyes narrow, he felt the flow of divine essence disrupted within his body, as Dumpy's presence alone made it harder for him to channel divine power. Whoa, he might be even stronger than me, Leo muttered, as Dumpy finally completed his descent, before lowering his gaze towards Leo as he said, "Greetings, Lord Father. This lowly frog greets you in earnest. I am back and ready to be deployed wherever you please," he said, as although everything else about him had changed, it seemed like his attitude and devotion towards Leo was still the same. Planet Satoru, Leo's POV. Although slightly surprised to see this new and evolved form of Dumpy, Leo soon regained his composure, as he smiled and said, "I'm glad to see you again, old friend. And no, I do not want you rushing back into war immediately." Leo began, as he looked toward Dumpy while the winds of planet Satoru brushed past them softly. "You've suffered enough these past few years already, and I would rather you stay beside me and live a calm life, until a truly worthwhile fight finally presents itself," he proposed, as the grin on his face widened. "Till then, shrink yourself and hover around my shoulder like old times. We will hang out, train, drink, and grow stronger. Just like we used to," he said casually, as though suggesting something completely ordinary despite Dumpy's current monstrous size. However, hearing that suggestion, Dumpy lowered his massive head slightly before shaking it with visible reluctance. "My apologies, Lord Father," Dumpy replied respectfully, as his deep voice rumbled across the empty field around them. "But after ascending into the demigod realm, I unfortunately lost the ability to shrink beneath this current form permanently." Leo raised an eyebrow slightly hearing that. "I can still gigantify myself further and temporarily reach nearly 450 feet in height during combat. However, this 45-foot form has now become my natural base state, and I cannot reduce my body beneath it anymore. Dumpy concluded, as a faint trace of disappointment surfaced in Leo's eyes afterward. So I suppose shoulder rides are officially dead now, he muttered beneath his breath, as memories from years ago briefly resurfaced inside his mind. Dumpy nodded slowly. However, although I lost one genetic ability after ascending, I gained another in return, Dumpy explained next, as his golden eyes glowed faintly beneath the evening sky. Leo's interest sharpened immediately afterward. Oh, he muttered. What did you get? Dumpy's massive chest expanded slightly before he answered. A new ability called Divine Essence Disruption, he said, as faint ripples spread through the surrounding divine essence almost instinctively after he spoke those words aloud. It does not completely erase divine essence from the environment the same way mana nullification affects mana. But it interferes with the natural flow of divine essence itself. Leo's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. So enemy gods attempting to cast techniques near you might fail to stabilize their abilities properly? He asked, immediately understanding the terrifying implications behind such a power. Dumpy nodded proudly afterward. Yes, Lord Father. There is now a significant chance that enemy techniques destabilize entirely while cast within my surrounding aura range. His voice deepened slightly afterward. With this ability, I believe I can become an extremely valuable support asset during future god-level warfare. A cocky grin spread slowly across Leo's face listening to that explanation. Support asset, Leo muttered, before chuckling softly afterward. Since when did you start talking like a lowly mongrel? Since when did you start classifying yourself as support instead of lead? Leo asked, as Dumpy tilted his head slightly in confusion. Am I incorrect though, Lord Father? He asked sincerely. While my arrogance has not faded, I do understand that with my current set of abilities, I can perform better as a support role fighter helping you from the back, rather than a frontline assaulter. However, if you want me to charge ahead, I will. I have not lost my balls. He explained, as listening to his words only made Leo laugh harder. Ha ha ha, no, you terrifying bastard, you are absolutely correct. You are better suited for a support role now. But it's just that, I did not expect you to talk so maturely. I guess, my little frog is truly not little anymore, Leo admitted, as he shook his head with visible satisfaction afterward. Honestly, hearing Dumpy explain his new abilities reassured Leo greatly internally, because although he rarely admitted it aloud, having Dumpy beside him during battle always made him feel significantly safer. Because while Dumpy was not the most perfect fighter, he was the most loyal protector Leo could ever want by his side. Alright, we will slay some gods together when the time comes, Leo assured, waving his hand casually. Although honestly, I don't think another major fight will happen anytime soon. His expression relaxed slightly afterward. But if shoulder rides are impossible now, then at least come drink with me for a while. Leo smirked faintly. I know alcohol still makes you happy. A strange warmth flickered through Dumpy's eyes hearing that invitation. I'm sure Amanda would also be glad to see you again, Leo added afterward. However, almost instantly, Dumpy raised one enormous hand politely. No offense, Lord Father, Dumpy replied carefully. I will gladly accept the drinks. But honestly, I only wish to spend time with you. Leo blinked once. The wife still feels slightly whiny bitch-like to me, Dumpy admitted awkwardly afterward. And after our previous interaction together, I have decided that avoiding her presence entirely is probably the safest option for my mental stability. For several seconds, Leo simply stared at him silently. Then, PFFT, ha 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 ha. Leo burst into laughter immediately afterward, as even the nearby cliffs trembled slightly from the force of his amusement. You're still annoyed with Amanda? He asked between chuckles. Dumpy looked away with complete seriousness. I am not annoyed, he answered calmly. I am unsure of how much patience I possess in me to tolerate her presence. That response somehow made it even funnier. Ha ha ha, alright, Leo replied eventually, as he wiped lightly at the corner of his eyes afterward. I won't force you to meet her, Leo said, as after that, the two eventually departed toward one of the desolate regions of planet Satoru where Dumpy's corrosive presence would not accidentally destroy surrounding civilian infrastructure. As beneath the crimson skies of Satoru, the cult master and his oldest companion opened a few bottles of the strongest whiskey available, and drank them in peace, while occasionally toasting a couple to the smoking man, who they both missed. 1 month later, the Emergency Virtual Gods Summit, Calith's POV. Calith attended the Righteous Alliance Summit with a visibly concerned expression on his face, as unlike several of the other clan gods present, he did not consider Yukiro's disappearance amusing in the slightest. The virtual hall remained silent for several moments, as projections of the universe's strongest figures sat around the enormous circular chamber with varying degrees of interest and concern. So, Caliph began eventually, as his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his throne. Is it confirmed that absolutely nobody has seen Yukiro during these past few months? The moment he asked that question, several gods exchanged suspicious glances quietly before slowly shaking their heads one after another. Apparently, one of them had managed to see or sense Yukiro these past few months, which was a concern, since a god usually never vanished so completely without a trace. The final time I personally saw him, he was pursuing a cult terrorist named General Sparrow during the battle outside planet Satoru. Liu Shen began, his eyes drifting across the other projections. I watched both of them enter the fourth dimension during combat. And ever since then, neither of them have appeared again. The atmosphere inside the summit hall grew noticeably quieter hearing that. This General Sparrow has already been confirmed to be a demigod according to the Liu clan's gathered intelligence, Luhan continued after Dutrask. Which in itself raises concerning questions regarding how exactly the cult managed to obtain a demigod breakthrough potion. His gaze drifted briefly toward Caliph afterward. However, since that is not the primary issue being discussed today, I suggest we avoid dwelling upon that detail excessively for now. Several eyes turned toward Caliph at those words. However, the Eternal Sovereign simply maintained a calm expression, as though refusing to even acknowledge the subtle implication hidden behind Luhan's statement. I mean, Liu Shen muttered eventually, as he rubbed lightly at his chin. He has to be trapped somewhere inside a bottomless dimensional fold, right? His brows furrowed afterward, because realistically speaking, there is absolutely no way a mere demigod could have actually killed Yukiro. Several gods nodded instinctively hearing that. Soren's origin blades were taken by Morris after the pit, Liu Shen continued. So unless the cult somehow possesses another hidden origin weapon, there should be no feasible way for them to permanently kill a god. Ru Vasa remained silent while listening carefully. Then eventually, it was Luhan who let out a long sigh. We simply do not know whether Soren possessed only those two blades, he admitted quietly. For all we know, the timeless assassin may have left behind additional weapons or artifacts for the cult before his death. The possibility unsettled several people inside the chamber. Still, Luhan continued afterward. I also struggle to believe that a demigod could realistically kill Yukiro in direct combat. His eyes darkened slightly. He was not the strongest among us. But neither was he weak. The summit hall fell silent once more afterward. Which means, Luhan concluded calmly. The dimensional void theory currently remains the most logical explanation for his disappearance. Liu Shen nodded thoughtfully hearing that. Fine then, he muttered. But if Yukiro truly is gone, what exactly happens to the territories controlled by the Yu clan? The moment that question was asked, the atmosphere inside the summit shifted immediately. Because unlike earlier, several gods now visibly showed interest. Dutark slowly licked his lips. Luhan's fingers tapped lightly against his throne again. Even Liu Shen's eyes sharpened faintly afterward. As though vultures had finally smelled blood. Ru Vasa immediately noticed it. And instantly looked disgusted. Yukiro is not dead, she said coldly, her voice carrying visible irritation. He will return eventually, so don't any of you dare start eyeing his territories like starving scavengers already. Her gaze swept across the hall afterward. Because when he comes back, there will be hell to pay. However, both Luhan and Dutark merely waved her concerns away dismissively. Please, Luhan replied casually. If Yukiro eventually returns, then naturally we would hand his territories back over. A faint smile appeared across his face afterward. But until then, someone must temporarily stabilize and protect those regions. Against enemies like the cult and the dragons. Dutark nodded immediately afterward. For safekeeping, you understand. Ru Vasa's expression twisted with disgust hearing that transparent excuse. However, she also understood something important immediately. The others had already made up their minds. And if the Ru clan refused participation entirely while the remaining clans divided Yu clan territory among themselves, then only the Ru clan would lose influence from the situation. Fine, Ru Vasa muttered eventually, as she rolled her eyes with visible annoyance. But once Yukiro returns, everything taken must immediately be returned to the Yu clan. Nobody answered her directly, which already told her enough. And while we are discussing larger threats, Ru Vasa continued afterward, her gaze sharpening dangerously. I propose we attack planet Satoru directly and eliminate the cult before this problem escalates further. The summit hall quieted again afterward. Because unlike the Yu clan discussion, this suggestion carried real consequences. They are becoming increasingly dangerous, Ru Vasa continued coldly. If the cult now possesses methods capable of producing demigods consistently, then allowing them additional time to grow would be idiotic. At that point, Caliph finally intervened personally. I agree. The moment the Eternal Sovereign spoke, every projection inside the summit hall focused toward him immediately. The cult must eventually be eliminated, Caliph said calmly, his expression unreadable as always. We already possess enough long-term headaches within the universe between Morris and Multheric alone. A faint pressure spread through the virtual chamber afterward. We do not need another rapidly growing god-level power destabilizing the political balance further. His eyes narrowed slightly afterward. And if the cult truly possesses the capability to raise demigods now, then eliminating them early would be significantly wiser than waiting for them to mature further. Several gods silently considered his words. So let us crush this problem while it still remains manageable, Caliph concluded quietly. However, almost immediately afterward, Luhan shook his head. Then, with all due respect, you and Ruvasa can handle it yourselves, he replied casually. His tone remained calm. 2 gods should already be more than sufficient to erase a single planet. While I personally have no intention of wasting time marching onto Satoru myself. Especially since the dragon territories remain increasingly aggressive lately, and I would rather focus on defending my own borders properly. Mu Shen nodded in agreement almost instantly afterward. So would I. Dutark also shrugged. The same applies to me. I need to look after the Du clan first. One after another, support for Caliph's proposal began quietly weakening. And although nobody openly opposed destroying the cult, very few actually seemed interested in personally risking themselves to do it. Which eventually left only Caliph and Ruvasa on board with the plan, as the 2 of them came to a consensus to wipe the cult out for once and for all. 3 months later, Planet Satoru, Leo's POV. The 3 months following the Emergency God Summit passed in a strangely calm yet dangerous manner, as although war continued spreading steadily across the universe, the large-scale retaliation that Leo eventually expected from the Righteous Alliance never truly arrived. As despite nearly 5 months passing since Yukiro's death, there were no major actions that were taken by the enemy. Instead, the cult continued expanding almost methodically. One planet, then another, then one more after that. At a pace of roughly 1 conquered world per month, the cult steadily pushed deeper into Righteous Alliance territory while resistance remained surprisingly disorganized compared to what Leo originally anticipated. However, although their territorial expansion proceeded smoothly on the surface, the pressure surrounding Yukiro's disappearance only continued growing heavier with each passing week. Divine probes constantly descended toward planet Satoru. Spies multiplied. Questions spread. And more than once, strange divine senses brushed against cult-controlled territory searching desperately for traces of the missing Yu clan god. Yet despite all that effort, nobody managed to uncover the truth. Because the wider universe still fundamentally refused to believe that a demigod could truly kill a god. Which meant that although suspicions continued growing, most powers still leaned toward the theory that Yukiro had become trapped somewhere within the endless folds of the 4th dimension, instead of ending up dead. Meanwhile, while the cult quietly consolidated its gains, the great clans themselves began devouring Yu clan territory exactly as Leo originally predicted. Using the excuse of instability following the death of the Yu clan patriarch and the prolonged disappearance of Yukiro himself, the Mu, Lu, Du, and Ru clans gradually moved troops and administrators into one Yu clan region after another. Military command shifted first, then economic oversight, then political authority, and before long, almost every major Yu clan territory had effectively fallen beneath external control despite technically still remaining under Yu clan ownership on paper. What surprised Leo most was how little resistance the Yu clan itself offered throughout the entire process. There were no large civil wars. No desperate retaliations. No suicidal last stands. Instead, the Yu clan simply accepted its humiliation quietly, because everyone understood the same brutal reality. Without Yukiro standing above them like an immovable pillar, the current Yu clan no longer possessed the strength necessary to push the other great clans back. And so, while the vultures tore apart the carcass slowly piece by piece, the once prideful Yu clan endured the humiliation silently like a crippled beast waiting for death. What a bunch of spineless cowards. Leo muttered as he clicked his tongue and shook his head. It seemed like after the death of their most important military commanders on the pit, and the loss of several divisions in trying to capture planet Satoru, the rest of the Yu clan no longer had a spine left, as they simply rolled over like toothless pups. As in hindsight, the entire situation almost felt surreal to Leo. A god disappearing had shifted the balance of the universe more violently than even several planetary wars combined. And because the great clans remained distracted fighting over U-clan territory amongst themselves, the cult's own expansion continued largely unanswered for the time being. However, if there was one development in particular that truly caught Leo's attention during these past 3 months, it was Caleb's increasingly exceptional battlefield performance. Because unlike Myron, who was carving his own path as an outlaw, Caleb had become almost the perfect model soldier. Disciplined, reliable, calm under pressure, and frighteningly effective during actual warfare. As reports suggested that during one of the cult's recent planetary conquest campaigns, Caleb went far beyond expectations to save countless lives, as he personally held back over 24 enemy lieutenants alone to ensure the safe retreat of his surrounded unit. At one critical stage of the battle, another lieutenant's division reportedly pushed too deeply into enemy territory before becoming trapped inside a narrow urban chokepoint, while enemy artillery and bombardment units began closing in from every direction simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, the entire situation should have collapsed into a complete massacre. However, Caleb reacted almost instantly. Rather than panicking or recklessly charging forward, he quickly reorganized surrounding defensive formations, stabilized retreat lines, and personally led a counter-push through the choke point itself while calmly directing suppressive fire and troop rotations under extreme battlefield pressure. For nearly 40 minutes straight, he held the defensive corridor almost perfectly despite overwhelming enemy pressure, buying enough time for the trapped lieutenant's forces to safely regroup and withdraw before total annihilation became inevitable. And because of that decision alone, thousands of soldiers survived a situation that should have ended in complete disaster. Yet despite earning enormous praise afterward, Caleb himself reportedly remained almost unchanged. There was no arrogance, no inflated ego, no reckless pride. Instead, he continued behaving exactly the same way he always had. Training harder than everyone else, following orders precisely, treating superiors respectfully, and helping junior soldiers whenever possible without caring about status or recognition. Which was why, according to multiple reports, Caleb had become unusually well-liked throughout his division and was inspiring many within the army to become like him. Because unlike many talented elites, Caleb never carried himself like someone inherently superior to others. And somehow, that only made his excellence stand out even more. As while Myron inspired fierce loyalty through conviction and emotion, Caleb inspired trust naturally through competence, discipline, and quiet reliability. And honestly, reading those reports reassured Leo greatly as a father. Because although one son was now walking an uncertain path through chaos and rebellion, at least the other still seemed capable of inheriting the cult's future properly someday. Caleb is shaping up to be what I hoped both my children would be like someday. He's close to breaking through to the monarch realm and rising to hold the rank of a commander. And as per Silva, he's already got the wits and calm necessary to lead his own division. Very soon, he may become one of the most important soldiers in the cult army. Leo muttered, as he let out a proud sigh. The times ahead were filled with uncertainties, and yet, knowing that he had such a reliable son, gave him some peace of mind at the least. 6 months after Yukiro's death, planet Satoru, Leo's POV. Finally, 6 months after he and Ver killed Yukiro within the depths of the 4th dimension, Leo received the first truly concrete signs of enemy retaliation moving against the cult. And while the identity of the person leading that retaliation did not surprise him very much, the source of the information certainly did. Because according to the report, the one leading the coming assault was Ruvasa, the Ru clan's mage god. Ruvasa, honestly, I'm not surprised that you're coming for us, Leo muttered quietly, as he shook his head while recalling the cult's recent campaigns against the Ru clan. After all, out of the 4 planets the cult captured during these past few months, 3 originally belonged to Ru clan territory, which meant the cult had effectively been preying on her influence and authority repeatedly without pause. And combined with the rumors surrounding her relationship with Yukiro, Leo understood perfectly why she seemed more emotionally invested in this matter than the other great clan gods. Because unlike the others who immediately descended upon Yu clan territory like vultures after Yukiro's disappearance, Ruvasa genuinely appeared angered by what happened to him. However, while her involvement itself was not particularly shocking, the second name attached to the report was significantly more concerning. As it seemed as though she had teamed up with Caliph, the eternal sovereign himself. So finally, it's time for that fateful encounter. Leo muttered, as the moment he saw that name attached to Ruvasa's, he immediately understood that the scale of the coming conflict had changed completely. Because unlike the other gods who viewed the cult as an emerging political threat, Caliph's hatred toward the cult stretched back many millennia. As to him, this was not merely war to him. This was unfinished history. Step. Inside his chambers atop planet Satoru's central command tower, Leo paced around quietly with the short letter resting within his hand, as he looked at it with absolute focus. I am simply letting you know that the Eternal Sovereign and Ruvasa will be attacking you sometime within the next 3 days. Signed, The Deceiver, Morris. Leo stared at the message silently for several moments afterward before eventually chuckling beneath his breath. Haha, what an unexpected time to be alive, he muttered, as the last thing he ever expected in life was receiving warnings about enemy movements from Morris of all people. And yet somehow, this strange universe had reached a point where even the Deceiver himself occasionally behaved more like an unpredictable ally than an enemy. Which was precisely why Leo refused to trust the information completely. Because if there was one man in existence whose words could never be accepted at face value, it was Morris. I won't blindly believe this information, Leo muttered quietly to himself, as he folded the letter carefully before placing it atop the desk beside him. But I also won't ignore it either. His eyes narrowed slightly afterward while countless possibilities rapidly formed within his mind. If this warning is genuine, then preparing for the attack is the correct decision. And if it's false, then at worst, I simply wasted a few days waiting for an outcome that never came to pass. Leo leaned back into his chair afterward before slowly exhaling through his nose while mentally reorganizing the current strength of the cult. Honestly, compared to 6 months ago, their situation had improved drastically. Dumpy had finally stabilized fully after his demigod breakthrough. Leonardo had recently entered the demigod realm as well. And with Ver steadily adapting toward greater mastery over his abilities after the battle against Yukiro, the cult now officially possessed 4 active demigods capable of participating in large-scale god-level warfare. Leo himself, Ver, Leonardo, and Dumpy, as that reality alone filled him with significantly more confidence than before. Because although fighting one god was already dangerous enough, fighting 2 simultaneously was an entirely different matter altogether unless overwhelming support existed around him. However now, if all 4 demigods coordinated properly together, then even facing Caliph and Ruvasa simultaneously no longer felt impossible anymore. Dangerous, absolutely. Potentially catastrophic, without question. But impossible? No, not anymore. And honestly, that realization itself marked how terrifyingly far the cult had already risen in such a short span of time. 6 months ago, the idea of openly fighting 2 gods simultaneously would have sounded suicidal to Leo. However, now, Leo genuinely believed victory was achievable. I suppose there's no avoiding it now, Leo muttered quietly, as his gaze drifted toward the crimson skies visible beyond the tower windows. If Caliph truly comes personally this time, then the balance of the universe will permanently change after this battle concludes. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest beneath him afterward while thoughts of future consequences spiraled rapidly through his mind. Because once the cult openly fought and survived against 2 active gods directly, every remaining power within the universe would finally be forced to acknowledge the same terrifying truth. The cult had officially returned as one of the universe's strongest ruling powers once again. And perhaps more importantly than even that, the long-awaited war between the Cult of Ascension and Caliph the Betrayer would finally reach its inevitable conclusion. This time, I won't let you go. This one will be for my mentor the Timeless Assassin, my idol, Soren, and for the cult's home world, Ixtal. Leo muttered, as for several long moments afterward, silence filled the room entirely. Then eventually, Leo rose slowly from his seat before turning toward the chamber exit with calm determination visible across his face. I need to gather everyone, he muttered quietly. Because once this fight starts, there will be no room for mistakes, and no possibility of backing down. This is a fight that Caliph started the day he betrayed the Timeless Assassin. And this is a fight we will finish 3 days from now. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.